For a young Oxford history student in the mid-21st century preparing for on-site study of one of the deadliest eras in humanity's history might seem as simple as receiving inoculations against the diseases of the 14th century and developing a plausible alibi. For a woman traveling alone, but for her instructors, it means painstaking calculations and careful monitoring of the rendezvous point where she is to be retrieved. These calculations are based, of course, on the premise that everything goes according to plan. And now Doomsday Book. Book 1. What a ringer needs most is not strength, but the ability to keep time. You must bring these two things together in your mind and let them rest there forever. Bells in Time, Bells in Time. Ronald Blythe at Kinfield. Chapter 1:1. Mr. Dunworthy opened the door to the laboratory, and his spectacles promptly steamed up. "Am I too late?" he said, yanking them off and squinting at Mary. "Shut the door," she said. "I can't hear you over the sound of those ghastly carols." Dunworthy closed the door, but it didn't completely shut out the sound of Zero. Come all the faithful wafting in from the quad. "Am I too late?" he said again. Mary shook her head. "All you've missed is Gilchrist's speech." She leaned back in her chair to let Dunworthy squeeze past her into the narrow observation area. She had taken off her coat and old hat and set them on the only other chair, along with a large shopping bag full of parcels. Her gray hair was in disarray, as if she'd tried to fluff it up after taking her hat off. A very long speech about medieval's maiden voyage. In time, she said, and the College of Braids knows, taking its rightful place as the jewel in history's crown. "Is it still raining?" "Yes," he said, wiping his spectacles on his muffler. He hooked the wire rims over his ears and went up to the thin glass partition to look at the net. In the center of the laboratory was a smashed-up wagon, surrounded by overturned trunks and wooden boxes. Above them hung the protective shields of the net. Draped like a gauzy parachute, Kevin's tutor Latimer, looking older and even more infirm than usual, was standing next to one of the trunks. Montoya was standing over by the console, wearing jeans and a terrorist jacket, and looking impatiently at the digital on her wrist. Bardry was sitting in front of the console, typing something in and frowning at the display screens. "Where's Kevin?" Dunworthy said. "I haven't seen her," Mary said. "Do come and sit down. The drop isn't scheduled till noon, and I doubt very much that they'll get her off by then, particularly if Gilchrist makes another speech." She draped her coat over the back of her own chair and set the shopping bag full of parcels on the floor by her feet. "I do hope this doesn't go all day. I must pick up my great-nephew Colin at the underground station at 3. He's coming in on the tube." She rummaged in her shopping bag. "My niece Deirdre is off to Kent for the holidays and asked me to look after him. I do hope it doesn't rain the entire time he's here," she said, still rummaging. "He's 12, nice boy. Very bright, though he has the most wretched vocabulary. Everything is either necrotic or apocalyptic, and Deirdre allows him entirely too many sweets." She continued to dig through the contents of the shopping bag. "I got this for him for Christmas." She hauled up a narrow red and green striped box. "I'd hoped to get the rest of my shopping done before I came here, but it was pouring rain, and I can only tolerate that. Ghastly digital carol on music on the high street." For brief intervals, she opened the box and folded back the tissue. "I've no idea what 12-year-old boys are wearing these days, but mufflers are timeless, don't you think, James?" "James." He turned from where he had been, staring blindly at the display screens. "What?" I said. "Mufflers are always an appropriate Christmas gift for boys, don't you think?" He looked at the muffler she was holding up for his inspection. It was of dark gray plaid wool. He would not have been caught dead in it when he was a boy, and that had been 50 years ago. "Yes," he said, and turned back to the thin glass. "What is it, James? Is something wrong?" Latimer picked up a small brass-bound casket and then looked vaguely around, as if he had forgotten what he intended to do with it. Montoya glanced impatiently at her digital. "Where's Gilchrist?" Dunworthy said. "He went through there," Mary said, pointing at a door on the far side of the net. "He lectured on medieval's place in history. Talked to Kivrin for a bit. The tech ran some tests. And then Gilchrist and Kivrin went through that door. I assume he's still in there with her. Getting her ready. Dunworthy muttered, "James, do come and sit down and tell me what's wrong," she said, jamming the muffler back in its box and stuffing it into the shopping bag. "And where you've been. I expected you to be here when I arrived. After all, Kevin's your favorite pupil. I was trying to reach the head of the history faculty," Dunworthy said, looking at the display screens. "Bazingami, I thought. He was off somewhere on Christmas vac." "He is." And Gilchrist maneuvered to be appointed acting head in his absence, so he could get the Middle Ages open to time travel. He rescinded the blanket ranking of 10 and arbitrarily assigned rankings to each century. Do you know what he assigned the 1300s? A 6. If Basingami had been here, he'd never have allowed it. But the man's nowhere to be found. He looked hopefully at Mary. "You don't know where he is." "Do you know?" she said. "Somewhere in Scotland, I think." "Somewhere in Scotland," he said bitterly. And meanwhile, Gilchrist is sending Kevin into a century, which is clearly a 10, a century which had Scrofula and the plague, and burned Joan of Arc at the stake. He looked at Bardry, who was speaking into the console's ear. "Now, you said Bardry ran tests. What were they? A coordinate check? A field projection?" "I don't know," she waved vaguely at the screens, with their constantly changing matrices and columns of figures. "I'm only a doctor, not a net technician." "I thought I recognized the technician. He's Rubeal, isn't he?" Dunworthy nodded. "He's the best tech Burial has," he said, watching Bardry, who was tapping the console's keys one at a time. His eyes on the changing readouts. All of New College's techs were gone for the vac. Gilchrist was planning to use a first-year apprentice. Who'd never run a man? Drop a first-year apprentice. For a remote, I talked him into using Bardelli. If I can't stop this drop, at least I can see that it's run by a competent tech. Burdett frowned at the screen, pulled a meter out of his pocket, and started toward the wagon. "Bardry," Dunworthy called. Bardry gave no indication he'd heard. He walked around the perimeter of the boxes and trunks. Looking at the meter, he moved one of the boxes slightly to the left. "He can't hear you, Mary," said Boudreau. He shouted, "I need to speak to you." Mary had stood up. "He can't hear you, James." She said the partition's soundproofed. Baudry said something to Latimer, who was still holding the brass-bound casket. Latimer looked bewildered. Baudry took the casket from him and set it down on the chalked mark. Dunworthy looked around for a microphone. He couldn't see one. "How are you able to hear Gilchrist's speech?" he asked. Mary Gilchrist pressed a button on the inside there, she said, pointing at a wall panel next to the net. Baudry had sat down in front of the console again and was speaking into the ear. The net shield began to lower into place. Baudry said something else, and they rose to where they'd been. "I told Bardry to recheck everything, the net, the apprentice's calculations, everything," he said, "and to abort the drop immediately if he found any errors, no matter what Gilchrist said." "But surely Gilchrist wouldn't jeopardize Kevin's safety," Mary protested. "He told me he'd taken every precaution." "Every precaution? He hasn't run recon tests or perimeter checks. We did 2 years of unmans in 20th century. Before we sent anyone through, he hasn't done any." Baudry told him he should delay the drop until he could do at least one, and instead he moved the drop up to days. The man's a complete incompetent. But he explained why the drop had to be today. Mary said in his speech, he said, "The contemps in the 1300s paid no attention to dates, except planting and harvesting times, and church holidays," he said. The concentration of holy days was greatest around Christmas, and that was why Medea had decided to send Kevin now, so she could use the Advent holidays to determine her temporal location and ensure her being at the drop site on December 28th. His sending her now has nothing to do with Advent or holy days. He said, watching Badri. He was back to tapping one key at a time and frowning. He could send her next week and use Epiphany for the rendezvous date. He could run in Mans for 6 months and then send her. Lapse time Gilchrist is sending her now because basing games off on holiday and isn't here to stop him. Oh dear, Mary said. I rather thought he was rushing it myself when I told him how long I needed Kivern in infirmary. He tried to talk me out of it. I had to explain that her inoculations needed time to take effect. A rendezvous on December 28th, Dunworthy said bitterly. Do you realize what holy day that is? The feast of the slaughter of the innocents, which in light of how this drop is being run, may be entirely appropriate. Why can't you stop it? Mary said. You can forbid Kevin to go. Can't you? You're her tutor. No, he said. I'm not. She's a student of Brasenose. Latimer's her tutor. He waved his hand in the direction of Latimer, who had picked up the brass-bound casket again and was peering absent-mindedly into it. She came to Belial and asked me to tutor her, unofficially. He turned and stared blindly at the thin glass. I told her then that she couldn't go. Kevin had come to see him when she was a first-year student. I want to go to the Middle Ages. She had said she wasn't even 1.5 meters tall, and her fair hair was in braids. She hadn't looked old enough to cross the street by herself. You can't, he had said. His first mistake. He should have sent her back to medieval, told her. She would have to take the matter up with her tutor. The Middle Ages are closed. They have a ranking of 10. A blanket 10, Kevin said, which Mr. Gilchrist says they don't deserve. He says that ranking would never hold up under a year-by-year analysis. It's based on the contempt's mortality rate, which was largely due to bad nutrition and no med support. The ranking wouldn't be nearly as high for an historian who'd been inoculated against disease. Mr. Gilchrist plans to ask the history faculty to evaluate the ranking and open part of the 14th century. I cannot conceive of the history faculty opening a century that had not only the Black Death and cholera, but the 100 Years' War, Dunworthy said. But they might. And if they do, I want to go. It's impossible. He said even if it were opened, medieval wouldn't send a woman. An unaccompanied woman was unheard of in the 14th century. Only women of the lowest class went about alone, and they were fair game for any man or beast who happened along. Women of the nobility, and even the emerging middle class, were constantly attended by their fathers, or their husbands, or their servants. Usually all three, and even if you weren't a woman, you're an undergraduate. The 14th century is far too dangerous for medieval to consider sending an undergraduate. They would send an experienced historian. It's no more dangerous than the 20th century. Kivrin said, mustard gas and automobile crashes and pinpoints. At least no one's going to drop a bomb on me. And who's an experienced medieval historian? Nobody has on-site experience. And your 20th century historians here at Balliol don't know anything about the Middle Ages. Nobody knows anything. There are scarcely any records except for parish registers and tax rolls. And nobody knows what their lives were like at all. That's why I want to go. I want to find out about them, how they lived, what they were like. Would you please help me? He finally said. I'm afraid you'll have to speak with Medieval about that. But it was too late. I've already talked to them, she said. They don't know anything about the Middle Ages either. I mean anything practical. Mr. Latimer is teaching me Middle English. But it's all pronominal inflections and vowel shifts. He hasn't taught me to say anything. I need to know the language and the customs, she said, leaning over Dunworthy's desk. And the money and table manners and things. Did you know they didn't use plates? They used flat loaves of bread called manchets. And when they finished eating their meat, they broke them into pieces and ate them. I need someone to teach me things like that, so I won't make mistakes. I'm a 20th century historian, not a medievalist. I haven't studied the Middle Ages in 40 years. But you know the sorts of things I need to know. I can look them up and learn them. If you'll just tell me what they are. What about Gilchrist, he said. Even though he considered Gilchrist a self-important fool. He's working on the re-ranking and hasn't any time. And what good will Larry ranking do if he has no historians to send, Dunworthy thought. What about the visiting American Professor Montoya? She's working on a medieval dig out near Whitney. Isn't she? She should know something about the customs. Miss Montoya hasn't any time either. She's so busy trying to recruit people to work on the Skengate dig. Don't you see they're all useless? You're the only one who can help me. He should have said, nevertheless, they are members of Brass's faculty, and I am not. But instead he had been, maliciously, delighted to hear her tell him what he had thought. All along that Latimer was a doddering old man. And Montoya a frustrated archaeologist, that Gilchrist was incapable of training historians. He had been eager to use her to show medieval, how it should be done. We'll have you augmented with an interpreter, he had said, and I want you to learn Church Latin Norman, French and Old German, in addition to Mr. Latimer's Middle English. And she had immediately pulled a pencil and an exercise book from her pocket and began making a list. We'll need practical experience in farming. Milking a cow, gathering eggs, vegetable gardening, he'd said, ticking them off on his fingers. Your hair isn't long enough. You'll need to take cortexates. You'll need to learn to spin with a spindle. Not a spinning wheel. The spinning wheel wasn't invented yet. And you'll need to learn to ride a horse. He had stopped, finally coming to his senses. Do you know what you need to learn? He had said, watching her earnestly. Bent over the list she was scribbling. Her braids dangling over her shoulders. How to treat open sores and infected wounds. How to prepare a child's body for burial. How to dig a grave. The mortality rate will still be worth a 10, even if Gilchrist somehow succeeds in getting the ranking changed. The average life expectancy in 13 was 38. You have no business going there. Kevin had looked up, her pencil poised above the paper. Where should I go to look at dead bodies? She had said earnestly, the morgue. Or should I ask Dr. Aarons in infirmary? I told her she couldn't go. Dunworthy said, still staring unseeing at the glass. But she wouldn't listen. I know Mary said she wouldn't listen to me either. Dunworthy sat down stiffly next to her. The rain and all the chasing after basing game had aggravated his arthritis. He still had his overcoat on. He struggled out of it and unwound the muffler from around his neck. I wanted to cauterize her nose for her. Mary said, I told her. The smells of the 14th century could be completely incapacitating, that we are simply not used to excrement and bad meat and decomposition in this day and age. I told her nausea would interfere significantly with her ability to function. But she wouldn't listen. Dunworthy said nope. I tried to explain to her that the Middle Ages were dangerous and Gilchrist wasn't taking sufficient precautions. And she told me I was worrying over nothing. Perhaps we are, Mary said. After all, it's Bartery who's running the drop, not Gilchrist. And you said he'd abort if there was any problem. Yes, he said, watching Bardry through the glass. He was typing again, one key at a time, his eyes on the screens. Bardry was not only a Balial's best tech, but the university's, and he had run dozens of remotes. And Kivrin's well prepared. Mary said, you've tutored her. And I've spent the last month in infirmary, getting her physically ready. She is protected against cholera and typhoid, and anything else that was extant in 1320, which, by the way, the plague you're so worried over wasn't. There were no cases in England. Until the Black Death reached there in 1348, I've removed her appendix and augmented her immune system. I've given her full-spectrum antivirals and a short course in medieval medicine, and she's done a good deal of work on her own. She was studying medicinal herbs while she was in infirmary. I know, Dunworthy said. She had spent the last Christmas vac memorizing masses in Latin and learning to weave and embroider, and he had taught her everything he could think of. But was it enough to protect her from being trampled by a horse or raped by a drunken knight on his way home from the Crusades? They were still burning people at the stake in 1320. There was no inoculation to protect her from that, or from someone seeing her come through and deciding she was a witch. He looked back through the thin glass. Latimer picked the trunk up for the third time and set it back down. Montoya looked at her watch again. The tech punched the keys and frowned. I should have refused to tutor her, he said. I only did it to show Gilchrist up for the incompetent. He is. Nonsense, Mary said. You did it because she's Kivern. She's you all over again, bright, resourceful, determined. I was never that foolhardy. Of course you were. I can remember a time when you couldn't wait to rush off to the London Blitz and have bombs dropped on your head, and I seem to remember a certain incident involving the old Bodleian. The prep room door flared open, and Kivrin and Gilchrist came into the room, Kevin holding her long skirts up. As she stepped over the scattered boxes, she was wearing the white rabbit fur-lined cloak and the bright blue kerchief she had come to show him yesterday. She had told him the cloak was hand-woven. It looked like an old wool blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, and the kerchief sleeves were too long. They nearly covered her hands. Her long fair hair was held back by a fillet and fell loosely onto her shoulders. She still didn't look old enough to cross the street by herself. Dunworthy stood up, ready to pound on the glass again as soon as she looked in his direction. But she stopped midway into the clutter, her face still half averted from him. Looked down at the marks on the floor, stepped forward a little, and arranged her dragging skirts around her. Gilchrist went over to Bardry, said something to him, and picked up a carrier board that was lying on top of the console. He began checking items off with a brisk poke of the light pen. Kevin said something to him and pointed at the brass-bound casket. Montoya straightened impatiently up from leaning over Bardry's shoulder and came over to where Kevin was standing. Shaking her head, Kivrin said something else more firmly, and Montoya knelt down and moved the trunk over next to the wagon. Gilchrist checked another item off his list. He said something to Latimer, and Latimer went and got a flat metal box and handed it to Gilchrist. Gilchrist said something to Kivrin, and she brought her flattened hands together in front of her chest. She bent her head over them and began speaking. Is he having a practice praying? Dunworthy said. That will be useful, since God's help may be the only help she gets. On this drop, they're checking the implant. Mary said, what implant? A special chip recorder, so she can record her field work. Most of the contempts can't read or write, so I implanted an ear and an A to D in one wrist, and a memory in the other. She activates it by pressing the pads of her palms together when she's speaking into it. It looks like she's praying. The chips have it to 0.5 gigabyte capacity, so she'd be able to record her observations for the full 2.5 weeks. You should have implanted a locator as well, so she could call for help. Gilchrist was messing with the flat metal box. He shook his head and then moved Kivrin's folded hands up. A little higher, the too long sleeve fell back. Her hand was cut. A thin brown line of dried blood ran down the cut. "Something's wrong," Dunworthy said, turning toward Mary. "She's hurt." "Kevin was talking into our hands again." Gilchrist nodded. Kevin looked at him, saw Dunworthy, and flashed him a delighted smile. Her temple was bloody too. Her hair under the fillet was matted with it. Gilchrist looked up, saw Dunworthy, and hurried toward the thin glass partition. Looking irritated, "She hasn't even gone yet. And they've already let her be injured." Dunworthy pounded on the glass. Gilchrist walked over to the wall panel, pressed a key, and then came over and stood in front of Dunworthy. "Mr. Dunworthy," he said. He nodded at Mary. "Dr. Orens, I'm so pleased you decided to come see Kivrin off." He put the faintest emphasis on the last 3 words so that they sounded like a threat. "What happened to Kevin?" Dunworthy said. "Happened," Gilchrist said. Sounding surprised, "I don't know what you mean." Kevin had started over to the partition, holding up the skirt of her kerchief with a bloody hand. There was a reddish bruise on her cheek. "I want to speak to her," Dunworthy said. "I'm afraid there isn't time." Gilchrist said. "We have a schedule to keep to. I demand to speak to her." Gilchrist pursed his lips, and 2 white lines appeared on either side of his nose. "May I remind you, Mr. Dunworthy," he said coldly, "that this drop is Bray's nose, is not Bailey's. I, of course, appreciate the assistance you have given in loaning us your tech, and I respect your many years of experience as an historian. But I assure you I have everything well in hand. Then, why is your historian injured before she's even left?" "Oh, Mr. Dunworthy, I'm so glad you came," Kivrin said. Coming up to the glass, "I was afraid I wouldn't be able to say goodbye to you." "Isn't this exciting?" "Exciting. You're bleeding," Dunworthy said. "What's gone wrong?" "Nothing," Kevin said, touching her temple gingerly, and then looking at her fingers. "It's part of the costume." She looked past him at Mary. "Dr. Orens, you came too. I'm so glad." Mary had stood up, still holding her shopping bag. "I want to see your antiviral inoculation," she said. "Have you had any other reaction besides the swelling, any itching?" "It's all right, Dr. Orens," Kivrin said. She held the sleeve back and then let it fall again. Before Mary could possibly have had a good look, at the underside of her arm, there was another reddish bruise on Kivrin's forearm, already beginning to turn black and blue. It would seem to be more to the point to ask her why she's bleeding, Dunworthy said. "It's part of the costume. I told you I'm Isabelle de Beauvoir, and I'm supposed to have been waylaid by robbers while traveling," Kevin said. She turned and gestured at the boxes and smashed wagon. "My things were stolen, and I was left for dead. I got the idea from you, Mr. Dunworthy," she said reproachfully. "I certainly never suggested that. You start out bloody and beaten," Dunworthy said. "Stage blood was impractical." Gilchrist said, "Probability couldn't give us statistically significant odds that no one would tend her wound. And it never occurred to you to dupe a realistic wound. You knocked her on the head instead," Dunworthy said angrily. "Mr. Dunworthy, may I remind you that this is Brasnos's project, not Belial's." "You're bloody right, it isn't. If it were 20th centuries, we'd be trying to protect the historian from injury, not inflicting it on her ourselves. I want to speak to Bardelli. I want to know if he's rechecked the apprentice's calculations." Gilchrist's lips pursed. "Mr. Dunworthy, Mr. Child, Hooley may be your net technician, but this is my drop, I assure you. We have considered every possible contingency." "It's just a nick," Kivrin said. "It doesn't even hurt. I'm all right. Really, please don't get upset. Mr. Dunworthy, the idea of being injured was mine. I remembered what you said." about how a woman in the Middle Ages was so vulnerable, and I thought it would be a good idea. If I looked more vulnerable than I was, it will be impossible for you to look more vulnerable than you are. Dunworthy thought, if I pretend to be unconscious, then I can overhear what people are saying about me, and they won't ask a lot of questions about who I am, because it will be obvious that. It's time for you to get into position, Gilchrist said, moving threateningly over to the wall panel. I'm coming, Kevin said, not budging. We're ready to set the net, I know, she said firmly. I'll be there as soon as I've told Mr. Dunworthy and Dr. Ahrens. Goodbye. Gilchrist nodded curtly and walked back into the debris. Latimer asked him something, and he snapped an answer. What does getting into position entail? Dunworthy asked, having him take a coach to you. Because probabilities told him there's a statistical possibility someone won't believe you're truly unconscious. It involves lying down and closing my eyes, Kevin said, grinning. Don't worry. There's no reason you can't wait until tomorrow, and at least give Bardry time to run a perimeter check. Dunworthy said, I want to see that inoculation again. Mary said, will you just stop fretting? Kevin said, my inoculation doesn't itch. The cut doesn't hurt. Boutrese spent all morning running checks. I know you're worried about me, but please don't be. The drop's on the main road from Oxford to Bath, only 2 miles from Skengate. If no one comes along, I'll walk into the village and tell them I've been attacked by robbers after I've determined my location, so I can find the drop again. She put her hand up to the glass. I just wanted to thank you both for everything you've done. I've wanted to go to the Middle Ages more than anything, and now I'm actually going. You're likely to experience headache and fatigue after the drop, Mary said. They're a normal side effect of the time lag. Gilchrist came back over to the thin glass. It's time for you to get into position, he said. I've got to go, she said, gathering up her heavy skirts. Thank you both so much. I wouldn't be going if it weren't for you to helping me. Goodbye, Mary said. Be careful, Dunworthy said. I will, Kevin said, but Gilchrist had already pressed the wall panel, and Dunworthy couldn't hear her. She smiled, held up her hand in a little wave, and went over to the smashed wagon. Mary sat back down and began rummaging through the shopping bag for a handkerchief. Gilchrist was reading off items from the carryboard. Kivrin nodded at each one, and he took them off with the light pen. What if she gets blood poisoning from that cut on her temple? Dunworthy said, still standing at the glass. She won't get blood poisoning. Mary said, I enhanced her immune system. She blew her nose. Kevin was arguing with Gilchrist about something. The white lines along his nose were sharply defined. She shook her head, and after a minute, he checked off the next item with an abrupt, angry motion. Gilchrist and the rest of medieval might be incompetent, but Kivrin wasn't. She had learned Middle English and Church, Latin and Anglo-Saxon. She had memorized the Latin masses and taught herself to embroider and milk a cow. She had come up with an identity and a rationale for being alone on the road between Oxford and Bath, and she had the interpreter and augmented stem cells and no appendix. She'd do swimmingly, Dunworthy said, which will only serve to convince Gilchrist. Medieval methods aren't slipshod and dangerous. Gilchrist walked over to the console and handed the carryboard to Barry. Kevin folded her hands again closer to her face, this time her mouth nearly touching them, and began to speak into them. Mary came closer and stood beside Dunworthy, clutching her handkerchief. When I was 19, which was, oh Lord, 40 years ago, doesn't seem that long. My sister and I traveled all over Egypt, she said. It was during the pandemic. Quarantines were being slapped on all about us, and the Israelis were shooting Americans on sight. But we didn't care. I don't think it even occurred to us that we might be in danger, that we might catch it or be mistaken for Americans. We wanted to see the pyramids. Kevin had stopped praying. Bardry left his console and came over to where she was standing. He spoke to her for several minutes. The frown never leaving his face, she knelt, and then lay down on her side next to the wagon, turning so she was on her back, with one arm flung over her head, and her skirts tangled about her legs. The tech arranged her skirts, pulled out the light measure and paced around her, walked back to the console and spoke into the ear. Kevin lay quite still, the blood on her forehead almost black under the light. "Oh dear, she looks so young," Mary said. Boutrice spoke into the ear, glared at the results on the screen, went back to Kivrin. He stepped over her, straddling her legs, and bent down to adjust her sleeve. He took a measurement, moved her arm so it was across her face, as if warding off a blow from her attackers. Measured again. "Did you see the pyramids?" Dunworthy said. "What Mary said when you were in Egypt, when you went tearing about the Middle East, oblivious to danger. Did you manage to see the pyramids?" No, Cairo was put under quarantine the day we landed. She looked at Kivrin lying there on the floor. "But we saw the Valley of the Kings." Badri moved Kivrin's arm a fraction of an inch, stood frowning at her for a moment, and then went back to the console. Gilchrist and Latimer followed him. Montours stepped back to make room for all of them. Around the screen, Bettery spoke into the console's ear, and a semi-transparent shield began to lower into place, covering Kivrin like a veil. "We were glad we went," Mary said. "We came home without a scratch." The shields touched the ground, draped a little like Kevin's to long skirts, stopped. "Be careful," Dunworthy whispered. Mary took hold of his hand. Latimer and Gilchrist huddled in front of the screen, watching the sudden explosion of numbers. Montoya glanced at her digital. Bardry leaned forward and opened the net. The air inside the shields glittered with sudden condensation. "Don't go," Dunworthy said. Transcript from the Doomsday Book. First entry, 22nd of December 2050 for Oxford. This will be a record of my historical observations of life in Oxfordshire, England. 13th of December 1320 to December 28th 1320. Old style break. Mr. Dunworthy, I'm calling this the Doomsday Book because it's supposed to be a record of life in the Middle Ages, which is what William the Conqueror's survey turned out to be, even though he intended it as a method of making sure he got every pound of gold and taxes tenants owed him. I am also calling it the Doomsday Book because I would imagine that's what you'd like to call it. You're so convinced something awful's going to happen to me. I'm watching you in the observation area right now, telling poor Dr. Ahrens all the dreadful dangers of the 1300s. You needn't bother. She's already warned me about time lag and every single medieval disease in gruesome detail. Even though I'm supposed to be immune to all of them, and warned me about the prevalence of rape in the 1300s, and when I tell her I'll be perfectly all right, she doesn't listen to me either. I will be perfectly all right, Mr. Dunworthy. Of course you will already know that, and that I made it back in one piece, and all according to schedule by the time you get to hear this. So you won't mind my teasing you a little. I know you are only concerned for me, and I know very well that without all your help and preparation, I wouldn't make it back in one piece or at all. I am therefore dedicating the Doomsday Book to you. Mr. Dunworthy, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be standing here in kerchief and cloak, talking into this recorder, waiting for Burdell and Mr. Gilchrist to finish their endless calculations and wishing they would hurry so I can go. Break. I'm here. Chapter 2. Well, Mary said on a long drawn-out breath, I could do with a drink. I thought you had to go fetch your great-nephew, Dunworthy said, still watching the place. Where Kivrin had been, the air glittered with ice particles. Inside the veil of shields near the floor, Frost had formed on the inside of the thin glass. The unholy three of medieval were still watching the screens, even though they showed nothing but the flat line of arrival. "I needn't fetch Colin until 3, Mary said. "You look as though you could use a bit of bracing up." "Yourself and the lamb and cross is just down the street." "I want to wait until he has the fix," Dan Worthy said, watching the tech. There was still no data on the screens, but Dree was frowning. Montoya looked at her digital and said something to Gilchrist. Gilchrist nodded, and she scooped up a bag that had been lying half under the console, waved goodbye to Latimer, and went out through the side door. Unlike Montoya, who obviously cannot wait to return to her dig, "I would like to stay until I'm certain Kevin got through without incident," Dunworthy said. "I'm not suggesting you go back to Beryl," Mary said, wrestling her way into her coat. "But the fix will take at least an hour, if not 2, and in the meantime, your standing here won't hurry it along." Watched. "Pardon all that, the pub's just across the way. It's very small and quite nice. There's also a place that doesn't put up Christmas decorations or play artificial bell music." She held his overcoat out to him. "We'll have a drink and something to eat, and then you can come back here and pace holes in the floor until a fix comes in. I want to wait here," he said, still looking at the empty net. Why didn't Basangami have a locator implanted in his wrist? The head of the history faculty has no business going off on holiday, and not even a number where he can be reached. Gilchrist straightened himself up from the still unchanging screen and clapped Bartery on the shoulders. Latimer blinked as if he wasn't sure where he was. Gilchrist shook his hand, smiling expansively. He started across the floor toward the thin glass partition, looking smug. "Let's go," Dunworthy said, snatching his overcoat from Mary and opening the door. A blast of wild shepherds watched their flocks by night hit them. Mary darted through the door as though she were escaping, and Dunworthy pulled it to behind them and followed Mary through the quad and out through Brazenoses gate. It was bitter cold, but it wasn't raining. It looked as though it might at any moment, though. And the crush of shoppers on the pavement in front of Brazenoses had apparently decided it would. At least half of them had umbrellas already opened. A woman with a large red one and both arms full of parcels bumped into Dunworthy. "Watch where you're going, can't you?" she said, and hurried on. "The Christmas spirit," Mary said, buttoning her coat with one hand and hanging on to her shopping bag with the other. "The pub's just down there past the chemist's," she said, nodding her head at the opposite side of the street. "It's these ghastly bells. I think they'd ruin anyone's mood." She started off down the pavement, through the maze of umbrellas. Dunworthy debated putting his coat on, and then decided it wasn't worth the struggle. For so short a distance, he plunged after her, trying to keep clear of the deadly umbrellas. And to determine what carol was being slaughtered now. It sounded like a cross between a call to arms and a dirge, but it was most probably Jingle Bells. Mary was standing at the curb opposite the chemist, digging in her shopping bag again. "What is that ghastly din supposed to be?" she said, coming up with a collapsible umbrella. "Oh, little town of Bethlehem, Jingle Bells," Dunworthy said, and stepped out into the street. "James," Mary said, and grabbed hold of his sleeve. The bicycle's front tire missed him by centimeters, and the near pedal caught him on the leg. The rider swerved, shouting, "Don't you know how to cross a bleeding street?" Dunworthy stepped backward and crashed into a 6-year-old holding a plush Santa. The child's mother glared. "Do be careful, James," Mary said. They crossed the street, Mary leading the way. Halfway across, it began to rain. Mary ducked under the chemist's overhang and tried to get her umbrella open. The chemist's window was draped in green and gold tinsel, and had a sign posted in among the perfumes that said, "Save the Marston Parish Church bells. Give to the Restoration Fund." The carillon had finished obliterating Jingle Bells, or O Little Town of Bethlehem, and was now working on We Three Kings of Orient Are. Dunworthy recognized the minor key. Mary still couldn't get her umbrella up. She shoved it back in the bag and took off down the pavement again. Dunworthy followed, trying to avoid collisions. Past a stationer's and a tobacconist, hung with blinking red and green lights. Through the door Mary was holding open for him. His spectacles steamed up immediately. He took them off to wipe at them. With the collar of his overcoat, Mary shut the door and plunged them into a blur of brown and blissful silence. "Oh dear," Mary said, "I told you." They were the sort that wouldn't put up decorations. Dunworthy put his spectacles back on. The shelves behind the bar were strung with blinking lights. In pale green, pink, and an anemic blue, on the corner of the bar was a large fiber-op Christmas tree on a revolving stand. There was no one else in the narrow pub except a beefy-looking man. Behind the bar, Mary squeezed between two empty tables and into the corner. "At least we can't hear those wretched bells in here," she said, putting her bag down on the settle. "No, I'll get the drinks." "You sit down, that cyclist nearly put you out." She excavated some mangled pound notes out of the shopping bag and went up to the bar. "2 pints of bitter," she told the barman. "Do you want something to eat?" she asked unworthily. "They've sandwiches and cheese rolls." Did you see Gilchrist staring at the console and grinning like the Cheshire Cat? He didn't even look to see whether Kevin had gone or whether she was still lying there, half dead. "Make that 2 pints and a good stiff whiskey," Mary said. Dunworthy sat down. There was a crash on the table, complete with tiny plastic sheep and a half-naked baby in a manger. Gilchrist should have sent her from the dig. He said the calculations for a remote are exponentially more complicated than for an on-site. "I suppose I should be grateful he didn't send a lapse time as well. The first-year apprentice couldn't do the calculations. I was afraid when I loaned him Bodrick, Gilchrist would decide he wanted a lapse time drop instead of a real time." He moved one of the plastic sheep closer to the shepherd. "If he's aware there's a difference," he said. "Do you know what he said when I told him he should run?" "At least one unmanned," he said. "If something unfortunate does happen, we can go back in time and pull Miss Engel out before it happens. Can't we?" The man has no notion of how the net works, no notion of the paradoxes, no notion that Kivrin is there. And what happens to her is real and irrevocable. Mary maneuvered her way between the tables, carrying the whiskey in one hand and the 2 pints awkwardly in the other. She set the whiskey down in front of him. "It's my standard prescription for cycling victims and overprotective fathers." "Did it catch you in the leg?" "No," Dunworthy said. "I had a bicycle accident in last week, one of your 20th centuries. Just back from a World War I drop, 2 weeks unscathed at Below Wood, and then walked into a high-wheeler on the Broad." She went back to the bar to fetch her cheese roll. "I hate parables," Dunworthy said. He picked up the plastic Virgin. She was dressed in blue with a white cloak. If he had sent her lapse time, at least, she wouldn't have been in danger of freezing to death. She should have had something warmer than a rabbit fur lining, or didn't it occur to Gilchrist that 1320 was the beginning of the Little Ice Age? "I've just thought who you remind me of," Mary said, setting down her plate and a napkin. "William Gadsden's mother." That was a truly unfair remark. William Gadsden was one of his first-year students. His mother had been up 6 times this term, the first time to bring William a pair of earmuffs. "He catches a chill if he doesn't wear them," she had told Dunworthy. "Willie's always been susceptible to chill, and now he's so far away from home." and all his tutor isn't taking proper care of him. Even though I've spoken to him repeatedly, Willie was the size of an oak tree and looked as susceptible to chill as one. I'm certain he can take care of himself. He had told Mrs. Gadsden, which was a mistake. She had promptly added Dunworthy to the list of people who refused to take proper care of Willie. But it hadn't stopped her coming up every 2 weeks to deliver vitamins to Dunworthy and insist that Willie be taken off the rowing team because he was overexerting himself. I would hardly put my concern for Kivrin in the same category as Mrs. Gadsden's overprotectiveness, Dunworthy said. The 1300s are full of cutthroats and thieves and worse. That's what Mrs. Gadsden said about Oxford, Mary said placidly, sipping her pint of ale. I told her she couldn't protect Willie from life, and you can't protect Kevin. You didn't become a historian by staying safely at home. You've got to let her go even if it is dangerous. Every century is a 10 James. This century doesn't have the Black Death. It had the pandemic which killed 65 million people. And the Black Death wasn't in England in 1320. She said it didn't reach there till 1348. She put her mug down on the table, and the figure of Mary fell over. But even if it had, Kivrin couldn't get it. I immunized her against bubonic plague. She smiled ruefully at Dunworthy. I have my own moments of Mrs. Gudsenitus. Besides, she would never get the plague, because we're both worrying over it. None of the things one frets about ever happens. Something one's never thought of does. Very comforting. He placed the blue and white Mary next to the figure of Joseph. It fell over, he said it carefully. Back up. It should be comforting, James, she said briskly, because it's obvious you've thought of every possible dreadful thing that could happen to Kivrin, which means she's perfectly all right. She's probably already sitting in a castle, having peacock pie for lunch. Although I suppose it isn't the same time of day there. He shook his head. There will have been some slippage. God only knows how much, since Gilchrist didn't do perimeter checks. Better, he thought it would be several days. Or several weeks, he thought. And if it were the middle of January, there wouldn't be any holy days for Kivrin to determine the date by. Even a discrepancy of several hours could put her on the Oxford Bath Road in the middle of the night. I do hope the slippage won't mean she missed Christmas, Mary said. She was terribly keen to observe a medieval Christmas Mass. It's 2 weeks till Christmas there. He said they're still using the Julian calendar. The Gregorian calendar wasn't adopted till 1752. I know Mr. Gilchrist orated on the subject of the Julian calendar in his speech. He went on at considerable length about the history of calendar reform and the discrepancy in dates between the old style and Gregorian calendars. At one point I thought he was going to draw a diagram. What day is it there? December 13th. Perhaps it's just as well we don't know the exact time. Deirdre and Colin were in the States for a year, and I was worried sick about them, but out of sync. I was always imagining Colin being run over on the way to school, when it was actually the middle of the night. Fretting doesn't work properly unless one can visualize disasters in all their particulars, including the weather and the time of day for a time. I worried about not knowing what to worry about, and then I didn't worry at all. Perhaps it will be the same with Kivrin. It was true. He had been visualizing Kivrin as he last saw her, lying amid the wreckage with her temple bloody, but that was probably all wrong. She had gone through nearly an hour ago. Even if no traveler had come along yet, the road would get cold, and he couldn't imagine Kivrin lying there, docile in the Middle Ages with her eyes closed. The first time he had gone through to the past, he had been doing there and backs while they calibrated the fix. They had sent him through in the middle of the quad, in the middle of the night, and he was supposed to stand there, while they did the calculations on the fix, and picked him up again, but he was in Oxford in 1956, and the check was bound to take at least 10 minutes. He had sprinted for blocks down the Broad to see the old Bodleian, and nearly given the tech heart failure when she opened the net and couldn't find him. Kevin would not still be lying there with her eyes shut, not with the medieval world spread out before her. He could see her suddenly, standing there in that ridiculous white cloak. Scanning the Oxford Bath Road for unwary travelers, ready to fling herself back on the ground. At a moment's notice, and in the meantime, taking it all in her implanted hands, clasped together in a prayer of impatience and delight. And he felt suddenly reassured. She would be perfectly all right. She would step back through the net into weeks' time. Her white cloak grubby beyond belief, full of stories about harrowing adventures, and hairbreadth escapes tailies to curdle the blood. No doubt, things that would give him nightmares for weeks. After her telling him about them, she'd be all right, you know. James Mary said, frowning at him, I know. He said he went and got them another half pint apiece. When did you say your great-nephew was getting in? At 3 Collins staying a week, and I've no idea what to do with him except worry. Of course, I suppose I could take him to the Ishmaelian. Children always like museums, don't they? Pocahontas robe and all that. Dunworthy remembered Pocahontas robe as being a completely uninteresting scrap of stiff, grayish material much like Collins' intended muffler. I'd suggest the Natural History Museum. There was a rattle of tinsel and some ding-dong, merrily on high, and Dunworthy looked anxiously over at the door. His secretary was standing on the threshold, squinting blindly into the pub. Perhaps I should send Colin up Carfax Tower to vandalize the Carillon, Mary said. It's Finch, Dunworthy said, and put his hand up so he could see them, but Finch had already started for their table. I've been looking for you everywhere, sir. He said something's gone wrong with the fix. His secretary looked blank. The fix, no, sir. It's the Americans, they've arrived early. What Americans? The bell ringers from Colorado. The Western States Women's Guild of Change and hand bell ringers. Don't tell me you've imported more Christmas bells, Mary said. I thought they were supposed to arrive on the 22nd. Dunworthy said to Finch, this is the 22nd. Finch said they were to arrive this afternoon. But their concert at Exeter was cancelled, so they're ahead of schedule. I called Medieval and Mr. Gilchrist told me. He thought you'd gone out to celebrate. He looked at Dunworthy's empty mug. I'm not celebrating, Dunworthy said. I'm waiting for the fix on one of my undergraduates. He looked at his watch. It will take at least another hour, you promised. You'd take them on a tour of the local bells, sir. There's really no reason why you need to be here, Mary said. I can ring you at Bailey's as soon as the fix is in. I'll come when we have the fix. Dunworthy said, glaring at Mary. Show them around the college and then give them lunch. That should take an hour. Finch looked unhappy. They're only here until 4 o'clock. They have a handbell concert tonight in Ely, and they're extremely eager to see Christ. Church's bells. Then take them to Christ Church. Show them Great Tom. Take them up in St. Martin's Tower. Take them round to New College. I will be there as soon as I can. Finch looked like he was going to ask something else, and then changed his mind. I'll tell them you'll be there within the hour, sir. He said and started for the door. Halfway there he stopped and came back. I almost forgot, sir. The vicar called to ask if you'd be willing to read the scripture. For the Christmas Eve inter-church service. It's to be at St. Mary the Virgin's this year. Tell him yes, Dunworthy said, thankful that he'd given up on the change ringers, and tell him, we'll need to get into the belfry this afternoon, so I can show these Americans the bells. Yes, sir. He said, what about Iffley? Do you think I should take them out to Islay? They've a very nice 11th century. By all means, Dunworthy said. Take them to Islay. I will be back as soon as I can. Finch opened his mouth and closed it again. Yes, sir, he said, and went out the door. To the accompaniment of the holly and the ivy. You are a bit hard on him, don't you think? Mary asked. After all, Americans can be terrifying. He'll be back in 5 minutes. Asking me whether he should take them to Christ Church. First, Dunworthy said, the boy is absolutely no initiative. I thought you admired that in young people. Mary said wryly, at any rate he won't go running off to the Middle Ages. The door opened, and the holly and the ivy started up again. That'll be him, wanting to know what he should give them for lunch. Boiled beef and overcooked vegetables, Mary said. Americans love to tell stories about our dreadful cooking. Oh dear. Dunworthy looked toward the door. Gilchrist and Laitmus stood there, haloed in the gray light from outside. Gilchrist was smiling broadly and saying something over the bells. Laitmus struggled to collapse a large black umbrella. I suppose we've got to be civil and invite them to join us, Mary said. Dunworthy reached for his coat. Be civil if you like. I have no intention of listening to those two congratulating each other for having sent an inexperienced young girl into danger. You're sounding like you know who again, Mary said. They wouldn't be here if anything had gone wrong. Perhaps Bardry's got the fix. It's too soon for that, he said. But he sat back down again, more likely. He threw them out so he could get on with it. Gilchrist had apparently caught sight of him. As he stood up, he half turned as if to walk back out again. But Latimer was already nearly to the table. Gilchrist followed, no longer smiling. Is the fix in? Dunworthy asked. The fix? Gilchrist said vaguely. The fix, Dunworthy said. The determination of where and when Kevin is. That makes it possible to pull her out again. Your text said it would take at least an hour to determine the coordinate, Gilchrist said stuffily. Does it always take him that long? He said he would come tell us when it was completed, but that the preliminary readings indicate that the drop went perfectly and that there was minimal slippage. What good news, Mary said, sounding relieved. Do come sit down. We've been waiting for the fix too, and having a pint. Will you have something to drink? She asked Latimer, who had got the umbrella down and was fastening the strap. Why, I believe I shall, Latimer said. This is, after all, a great day. A drop of brandy, I think. Strong wash the wean, and well to drink useless. He fumbled with the strap, getting it tangled in the ribs of the umbrella. At last we had the chance to observe the loss of adjectival inflection and the shift to the nominative singular at first hand. A great day, Dunworthy thought, but he felt relieved in spite of himself. The slippage had been his greatest worry. It was the most unpredictable part of a drop. Even with perimeter checks, the theory was that it was the net's own safety and abort mechanism. Time's way of protecting itself from continuing paradoxes. The shift forward in time was supposed to prevent collisions, or meetings or actions that would affect history, sliding the historian neatly past the critical moment when he might shoot Hitler or rescue the drowning child. But net theory had never been able to determine what those critical moments were, or how much slippage any given drop might produce. The perimeter checks gave probabilities, but Gilchrist hadn't done any. Kivrin's drop might have been off by 2 weeks, or a month for all Gilchrist knew. She might have come through in April, in her fur-lined cloak and winter kerchief. But Bardry had said minimal slippage. That meant Kevin was off by no more than a few days, with plenty of time to find out the date and make the rendezvous. Mr. Gilchrist, Mary was saying, can I get you a brandy? No thank you, he said. Mary rummaged for another crumpled note and went over to the bar. Your text seems to have done a passable job, Gilchrist said, turning to Dunworthy. Medieval would like to arrange to borrow him for our next drop. We'll be sending Miss Engel to 1355 to observe the effects of the Black Death. Contemporary accounts are completely unreliable, particularly in the area of mortality rates. The accepted figure of 50 million deaths is clearly inaccurate, and estimates that it killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe for obvious exaggerations. I'm eager to have Miss Engel make trained observations. Aren't you being rather premature? Dunworthy said perhaps you should wait to see if Kivrin manages to survive this drop, or at the very least gets through to 1320 safely. Gilchrist's face took on its pinched look. It strikes me as somewhat unjust that you constantly assume Medieval is incapable of carrying out a successful drop, he said. I assure you, we have carefully thought out its every aspect. The method of Kevin's arrival has been researched in every detail. Probability puts the frequency of travelers on the Oxford-Bath Road as 1 every 1.6 hours, and it indicates a 92% chance of her story of an assault being believed. Due to the frequency of such assaults, a wayfarer in Oxfordshire had a 40.5% chance of being robbed. In winter, 58.6% in summer. That's an average, of course. The chances were greatly increased in parts of O'Timor and the Weishwood and on the smaller roads. Dunworthy wondered how on earth probability had arrived at those figures. The Doomsday Book didn't list thieves, with the possible exception of the king's census takers, who sometimes took more than the census, and the cutthroats of the time surely hadn't kept records of whom they had robbed and murdered. The locations marked neatly on a map, proofs of deaths away from home, had been entirely de facto. The person had failed to come back, and how many bodies had lain in the woods, undiscovered and unmarked by anyone. I assure you, we have taken every precaution possible to protect, Kevin Gilchrist said, such as perimeter checks. Dunworthy said, and unmans and symmetry tests. Mary came back. Here we are, Mr. Latimer, she said, putting a glass of brandy down in front of him. She hooked Latimer's wet umbrella over the back of the settle and sat down beside him. I was just assuring Mr. Dunworthy that every aspect of this drop was exhaustively researched, Gilchrist said. He picked up the plastic figurine of a wise man carrying a gilt box. The brass-bound casket in her equipage is an exact reproduction of a jewel casket. In the Ishmaelian, he set the wise man down. Even her name was painstakingly researched. Isabel is the woman's name, listed most frequently in the assize rolls, and the Augusta Regum for 1295 through 1320. It is actually a corrupted form of Elizabeth, Latimer said, as if it were one of his lectures. Its widespread use in England from the 12th century is thought to trace its origin to Isabel of Angulum, wife of King John. Kevin told me she'd be given an actual identity, that Isabel de Bovelet was one of the daughters of a Yorkshire nobleman. Damworthy said she was. Gilchrist said Gilbert de Beauvoir had 4 daughters in the appropriate age range, but their Christian names were not listed in the rolls. That was a common practice. Women were frequently listed only by surname and relationship, even in parish registers and on tombstones. Mary put a restraining hand on Dunworthy's arm. Why did you choose Yorkshire? She asked quickly. Won't that put her a long way from home? She's 700 years from home, Dunworthy thought. In a century that didn't value women enough to even list their names when they died, Miss Engel was the one who suggested that. Gilchrist said she felt having the estate so distant would ensure that no attempt would be made to contact the family or to cart her back them miles from the drop. Kivrin had suggested it. She had probably suggested the whole thing. Searching through exchequer rolls and church registers for a family with a daughter the right age and no court connections, a family far enough up into the East Riding that the snow and the impassable roads would make it impossible for a messenger to ride. and tell the family a missing daughter had been found. Medieval has given the same careful attention to every detail of this drop. Gilchrist said even to the pretext for her journey. Her brother's illness, we were careful to ascertain that there had been an outbreak of influenza in that section of Gloucestershire in 1319. Even though illness was abundant during the Middle Ages, and he could just as easily have contracted cholera or blood poisoning, James Mary said warningly. Miss Engle's costume was hand-sewn. The blue cloth for her dress was hand-dyed with Wade, using a medieval recipe, and Miss Montoya has exhaustively researched the village of Skengate, where Kivrin will spend the 2 weeks. If she makes it there, Dunworthy said. James Mary said, what precautions have you taken to ensure that the friendly traveler, who happens along every 1.6 hours, doesn't decide to cart her off to the convent at Godstow, or a brothel in London, or see her come through and decide she's a witch? What precautions have you taken to ensure that the friendly traveler is, in fact, friendly, and not one of the cutthroats who waylay 40.5% of all passers-by? Probability indicated there was no more than a 0.04% chance of someone being at the location at the time of the drop. Oh, look, here's Bettery already, Mary said, standing up and putting herself between Dunworthy and Gilchrist. That was quick work, Bettery. Did you get the fix all right? Boudreau had come away without his coat. His lab uniform was wet, and his face was pinched with cold. You look half frozen, Mary said. Come and sit down. She motioned to the empty place on the settle. Next to Latimer, I'll fetch you a brandy. Did you get the fix? Dunworthy said. Bardry was not only wet, he was drenched. Yes, he said, and his teeth started to chatter. Good man, Gilchrist said, standing up and clapping him on the shoulder. I thought you said it would take an hour. This calls for a toast. Have you any champagne? He called out to the barman, clapped Battery on the shoulder again, and went over to the bar. Padre stood looking after him, rubbing his arms and shivering. He seemed inattentive, almost dazed. You definitely got the fix? Dunworthy asked. Yes, he said, still looking after Gilchrist. Mary came back to the table carrying the brandy. This should warm you up a bit, she said, handing it to him there. Drink it down, doctor's orders. He frowned at the glass, as if he didn't know what it was. His teeth were still chattering. What is it? Dunworthy said. Kivrin's all right, isn't she, Kevin? He said, still staring at the glass, and then seemed suddenly to come to himself. He set the glass down. I need you to come, he said, and started to push his way back through the tables to the door. What's happened? Dunworthy said. Standing up, the crushed figures fell over, and one of the sheep rolled across the table and fell off. Buttery opened the door. On the carillons clanging of good Christian men rejoice. Bardry, wait, we'd have a toast, Gilchrist said, coming back to the table with a bottle and a tangle of glasses. Dunworthy reached for his coat. What is it? Mary said, reaching for her shopping bag. Didn't he get the fix? Dunworthy didn't answer. He grabbed up his overcoat and took off after Bardray. The tech was already halfway down the street, pushing his way through the Christmas shoppers. As if they weren't even there, it was raining hard. But Bardray seemed oblivious to that too. Dunworthy pulled his overcoat more or less on and shoved into the crowd. Something had gone wrong. There had been slippage after all, or the first year. Apprentice had made an error in the calculations. Perhaps something had gone wrong with the net itself, but it had safeties and layers and bolts. If anything had gone wrong with the net, Kevin simply couldn't have gone through. And Barry had said he'd got the fix. It had to be the slippage. It was the only thing that could have gone wrong. And the drops still take place ahead. Bardry crossed the street, narrowly avoiding a bicycle. Dunworthy barged between two women carrying shopping bags, even larger than Mary's. and over a white terrier on a leash, and caught sight of him again to doors up. Boudreaux, he called the tech, half-turned and crashed straight into a middle-aged woman with a large, flowered umbrella. The woman was bent against the rain, holding the umbrella nearly in front of her, and she obviously didn't see Baudry either. The umbrella, which was covered with lavender violets, seemed to explode upward and then fell top down onto the pavement, Baudry still plunging blindly ahead. Nearly fell over it. Watch where you're going, won't you? The woman said angrily, grabbing at the edge of the umbrella. This is hardly the place to run then, is it? Boudreaux looked at her and then at the umbrella, with the same dazed look he had had in the pub. Sorry, don't worry, they could see him say, and bend to pick it up. The two of them seemed to wrestle over the expanse of violets for a moment before Baudry got hold of the handle. And righted the umbrella. He handed it to the woman, whose heavy face was red with rage, or the cold rain, or both. Sorry, she said, raising the handle over her head, as if she were going to strike him with it. Is that all you've got to say? He put his hand uncertainly up to his forehead, and then, as he had in the pub, seemed to remember where he was and took off again. Practically running, he turned in at Bracenos's gate, and Dunworthy followed across the quad. In a side door to the laboratory, down a passage and into the net area. Baudry was already at the console, bending over it and frowning at the screen. Dunworthy had been afraid it would be awash with garbage or worse, blank, but it showed the orderly columns of figures and matrices of a fix. You got the fix? Dunworthy said, panting. Yes, Baudry said. He turned and looked at Dunworthy. He had stopped frowning, but there was an odd, abstracted look on his face, as if he were trying hard to concentrate. When was? He said, and began to shiver. His voice trailed off, as if he had forgotten what he was going to say. The thin glass door banged, and Gilchrist and Mary came in, with Latimer at their heels, fumbling with his umbrella. What is it? What's happened? Mary said. When was what? Barbara Dunworthy demanded. I got the fix. Baudry said. He turned and looked at the screen. Is this it? Gilchrist said, leaning over his shoulder. What do all these symbols mean? You'll need to translate for us laymen. When was what? Dunworthy repeated. Baudry put his hand up to his forehead. There's something wrong, he said. What? Dunworthy shouted. Slippage. Is it the slippage? Slippage, Baudry said, shivering so hard he could hardly get the word out. Baudry. Mary said. Are you all right? Baudry got the odd, abstracted look again, as if he were considering the answer. No, he said, and pitched forward across the console. Chapter 3. She heard the bell as she came through. It sounded thin and tinny, like the piped-in bell music they were playing in the high for Christmas. The control room was supposed to be soundproof, but every time someone opened the anteroom door, from outside she had been able to hear the faint, ghostly sound of Christmas carols. Dr. Ahrens had come in first, and then Mr. Dunworthy, and both times Kevin had been convinced. They were there to tell her she wasn't going, after all. Dr. Ahrens had nearly canceled a drop in hospital when Kivrin's antiviral inoculation had swelled up into a giant, red welt on the underside of her arm. You're not going anywhere until the swelling goes down, Dr. Ahrens had said, and refused to discharge her from hospital. Kevin's arm still itched, but she wasn't about to tell Dr. Ahrens that, because she might tell Mr. Dunworthy, who had been acting horrified ever since he found out she was going. I told him 2 years ago I wanted to go, Kevin thought. 2 years ago. And when she'd gone to show him her costume yesterday, he was still trying to talk her out of it. I don't like the way medieval's running this drop, he'd said, and even if they were taking the proper precautions, a young woman has no business going to the Middle Ages alone. It's all worked out, she told him. I'm Isabel de Bovet, daughter of Gilbert de Bovet. a nobleman who lived in the East. Writing from 1276 to 1332, and what was the daughter of a Yorkshire nobleman? Doing on the Oxford Bath Road alone? I wasn't. I was with all my servants. Traveling to Evesham to fetch my brother, who's lying ill in the monastery there. And we were set upon by robbers. By robbers, he said. Blinking at her through his spectacles, I got the idea from you. You said young women didn't travel anywhere alone. In the Middle Ages that they were always attended, so I was attended. But my servants bolted when we were attacked, and the robbers took the horses and all my goods. Mr. Gilchrist thinks it's a plausible story. He said the probability of it's a plausible story, because the Middle Ages were full of cutthroats. And thieves I know, she said impatiently, and disease carriers, and marauding knights and other dangerous types. Weren't there any nice people in the Middle Ages? They were all busy burning witches at the stake. She had decided she'd better change the subject. I came to show you my costume, she'd said, turning slowly so he could see her. Blue kerchief and white fur-lined cloak. My hair will be down for the drop. You have no business wearing white to the Middle Ages. He'd said it will only get dirty. He hadn't been any better this morning. He had paced the narrow observation area, like an expectant father. She had worried the whole morning that he would suddenly try to call a halt to the whole proceeding. There had been delays and more delays. Mr. Gilchrist had had to tell her all over again how the recorder worked, as if she were a first-year student. Not one of them had any faith in her, except possibly Bordier. And even he had been maddeningly careful, measuring and remeasuring the net area, and once erasing an entire series of coordinates and entering it again. She had thought the time would never come for her to get into position. And after she had, it was even worse, lying there with her eyes closed, wondering what was going on. Latimer told Gilchrist he was worried about the spelling of Isabel. They had chosen, as if anyone back then had known how to read, let alone spell. Montoya came and stood over her, and told her the way to identify Skendgate was by its church's frescoes of the Last Judgment. Something she had told Kevin at least a dozen times before, someone she thought Padre, because he was the only one who didn't have any instructions for her. Bent and moved her arm a little in toward her body, and tugged at the skirt of her kerchief. The floor was hard, and something was digging into her side. Just below her ribs, Mr. Gilchrist said something, and the bell started up again. Please, Kivrin thought. Please, wondering if Dr. Aarons had suddenly decided Kivrin needed another inoculation, or if Dunworthy had raced off to the history faculty and gotten them to change the rating back to a 10. Whoever it was must be holding the door open. She could still hear the bell, though she couldn't make out the tune. It wasn't a tune. It was a slow, steady tolling that paused and then went on. And Kevin thought, I'm through. She was lying on her left side, her legs sprawled awkwardly, as if she'd been knocked down by the men who had robbed her, and her arm half flung over her face to ward off the blow that had sent the blood trickling down the side of her face. The position of her arm should make it possible for her to open her eyes without being seen. But she didn't open them yet. She lay still, trying to listen. Except for the bell, there was no sound at all. If she were lying on a 14th century roadside, there should be birds and squirrels, at least. They had probably been shocked into silence by her sudden appearance, or by the net's halo, which left shimmering frost-like particles in the air for several minutes. After a long minute, a bird twittered, and then another one. Something rustled nearby, then stopped and rustled again. A 14th century squirrel or a wood mouse. There was a thinner rustle. That was probably wind in the branches of the trees. though she couldn't feel any breeze on her face. And above it from very far away, the distant sound of the bell. She wondered why it was tolling. It could be ringing vespers or matins. Bardry had told her he didn't have any idea how much slippage there would be. He had wanted to postpone the drop while he ran a series of checks. But Mr. Gilchrist had said probability had predicted average slippage of 6.4 hours. She didn't know what time she had come through. It had been 11:15 when she came out of prep. She had seen Miss Montoya looking at a digital and asked her what time it was, but she had no idea how long it had taken. After that, it had seemed like hours. The drop had been scheduled for noon if she had come through on time, and probability was right about the slippage. It would be 6 o'clock in the evening, which was too late for vespers. And if it were vespers, why did the bell go on tolling? It could be tolling for mass, or for a funeral or a wedding. Bells had rung almost constantly in the Middle Ages to warn of invasions or fires, to help a lost child find its way back to the village, even to ward off thunderstorms. It could be ringing for any reason at all. If Mr. Dunworthy were here, he'd be convinced it was a funeral. Life expectancy in 13 was 38 years. He had told her when she first said she wanted to go to the Middle Ages, and you only lived that long if you survived cholera and smallpox and blood poisoning, and if you didn't eat rotten meat or drink polluted water or get trampled by a horse or get burned at the stake for witchcraft or freeze to death. Kevin thought she was beginning to feel stiff with cold, though she had been lying there only a little while. Whatever was poking her in the side felt like it had gone through her rib cage and was puncturing her lung. Mr. Gilchrist had told her to lie there for several minutes and then stagger to her feet as if coming out of unconsciousness. Kevin had thought several minutes was hardly enough, considering probabilities, assessment of the number of people on the road. It would surely be more than several minutes before a traveler happened along, and she was unwilling to give up the advantage her appearing to be unconscious gave her. And it was an advantage, in spite of Mr. Dunworth's idea that half of England would converge on an unconscious woman to rape her, while the other half waited nearby with a stake they intended to burn her at. If she was conscious, her rescuers would ask her questions. If she was out cold, they would discuss her and other things besides. They would talk about where to take her and speculate on who she might be and where she might have come from. Speculations with a good deal more information in them than who or you had. But now she felt an overwhelming urge to do what Mr. Gilchrist had suggested: get up and look around. The ground was cold, her side hurt, and her head was starting to throb in time with the bell. Dr. Ahrens had told her that would happen. Traveling this far into the past would give her symptoms of time lag, headache, insomnia, and a general botch up of the circadian rhythms. She felt so cold. Was that a symptom of the time lag too, or was the ground she was lying on cold enough to penetrate her fur-lined cloak this quickly? Or was the slippage worse than the tech had thought, and it was really the middle of the night? She wondered if she was lying in the road. If she was, she should certainly not stay there. A fast horse or the wagon that had made the ruts might roll right over her in the dark. Bells don't ring in the middle of the night, she told herself, and there was too much light filtering through her closed eyelids for it to be dark. But if the bell she could hear was a Vespers bell, that would mean it was getting dark, and she had better get up and look around. Before night fell, she listened all over again, to the birds, to the wind in the branches, to a steady scraping sound. The bell stopped, the echo of it ringing in the air, and there was a little sound, like an intaken breath, or the shuffle of a foot on soft dirt, very close. Kevin tensed. hoping the involuntary movement didn't show through her. Concealing cloak and waited, but there were no footsteps or voices and no birds. There was someone or something standing over her. She was sure of it. She could hear its breathing. Feel its breath on her. It stood there for a long time, not moving. After what seemed like an endless space of time, Kivrin realized she was holding her own breath and let it out slowly. She listened, but now she couldn't hear anything over the throbbing of her own pulse. She took a deep sighing breath and moaned. Nothing, whatever it was, didn't move. Didn't make a sound, and Mr. Dunworthy had been right. Pretending to be unconscious was no way to come into a century. Werewolves still prowled the forests, and bears. The birds abruptly began to sing again, which meant either it was not a Volf or the Volf had gone away. Kevin went through the ritual of listening again and opened her eyes. She couldn't see anything but her sleeve, which was against her nose, but just the act of opening her eyes made her head ache. Worse, she closed her eyes, whimpered, and stirred, moving her arm enough so that when she opened her eyes again, she would be able to see something. She moaned again and fluttered her eyes open. There was no one standing over her. And it wasn't the middle of the night. The sky overhead, through the tangled branches of the trees, was a pale grayish-blue. She sat up and looked around. Almost the first thing Mr. Dunworthy had said to her. That first time she had told him she wanted to go to the Middle Ages was they were filthy and disease-ridden. The muck hole of history, and the sooner you get rid of any fairy tale notions you have about them, the better. And he was right, of course he was right. But here she was in a fairy wood, she and the wagon, and all the rest of it had come through in a little open space, too small and shadow to be called a glade. Tall, thick trees arched above and over it. She was lying under an oak tree. She could see a few scalloped leaves in the bare branches high above. The oak was full of nests, though the birds had stopped again, traumatized by her movement. The underbrush was thick, a mat of dead leaves and dry weeds. That should have been soft, but wasn't. The hard thing Kevin had been lying on was the cap of an acorn. White mushrooms spotted with red clustered near the gnarled roots of the oak tree. They and everything else in the little glade, the tree trunks, the wagon. The ivy glittered with the frosty condensation of the halo. It was obvious that no one had been here, had ever been here, and equally obvious that this wasn't the Oxford Bath Road, and that no traveler was going to happen along in 1.6 hours or ever. The medieval maps they'd used to determine the site of the drop had apparently been as inaccurate as Mr. Dunworthy had said. They were. The road was obviously farther north than the maps had indicated, and she was south of it in Weeshwood Forest. Ascertain your exact spatial and temporal location immediately, Mr. Gilchrist had said. She wondered how she was supposed to do that. Ask the birds. They were too far above her for her to see what species they were, and the mass extinctions hadn't started until the 1970s, shorter than being passenger pigeons or dodos. Their presence wouldn't point to any particular time or place anyway. She started to sit up, and the birds exploded into a wild flurry of flapping wings. She stayed still until the noise subsided, and then rose to her knees. The flapping started all over again. She clasped her hands, pressing the flesh of her palms together and closing her eyes so if the traveler who was supposed to find her happened by, it would look like she was praying. "I'm here," she said, and then stopped. If she reported that, she had landed in the middle of a wood instead of on the Oxford Bath Road. It would just confirm what Mr. Dunworthy was thinking, that Mr. Gilchrist hadn't known what he was doing, and that she couldn't take care of herself. And then she remembered that it wouldn't make any difference. that he would never hear her report until she was safely back, if she got safely back, which she wouldn't if she was still in this wood. When night fell, she stood up and looked around. It was either late afternoon or very early morning. She couldn't tell in the woods, and she might not be able to tell by the sun's position, even when she got where she could see the sky. Mr. Dunworthy had told her that people sometimes stayed hopelessly, turned around for their entire stay in the past. He had made her learn to sight using shadows, but she had to know what time it was to do that, and there was no time to waste on wondering which direction was which. She had to find her way out of here. The forest was almost entirely in shadow. There was no sign of a road or even a path. Kevin circled the wagon and boxes, looking for an opening in the trees. The woods seemed thinner to what felt like the west, but when she went that way, looking back every few steps, to make sure she could still see the weathered blue of the wagon's cloth covering, it was only a stand of birches, their white trunks giving an illusion of space. She went back to the wagon and started out again, in the opposite direction, even though the woods looked darker that way. The road was only 100 yards away. Kevin clambered over a fallen log and through a thicket of drooping willows and looked out onto the road. A highway, probability had called it. It didn't look like a highway. It didn't even look like a road. It looked more like a footpath or a cowpath. So these were the wonderful highways of 14th century England, the highways that were opening trade and broadening horizons. The road was barely wide enough for a wagon, though it was obvious that wagons had used it. Or at least a wagon. The road was rutted into deep grooves, and leaves had drifted across and into the ruts. Black water stood in some of them and along the road's edge, and a skim of ice had formed on some of the puddles. Kivrin was standing at the bottom of a depression. The road climbed steadily up in both directions, from where she was and to what felt like the north. The trees stopped halfway up the hill. She turned to look back. It was possible to catch a glimpse of the wagon from here, the merest patch of blue, but no one would. The road dived here into woods on either side and narrowed, making it a perfect spot in which to be waylaid by cutthroats and thieves. It was just the place to lend credibility to her story, but they would never see her hurrying through the narrow stretch of road, or if they did catch sight of the barely visible corner of blue, they would think it was someone lying in wait and spur their horses into flight. It came to Kivrin suddenly that lurking there in the thicket, she looked more like one of those cutthroats than like an innocent maiden who'd been recently cautioned on the head. She stepped out onto the road and put her hand up to her temple. "Oh, hope and may for ye am full sore and drayed," she cried. The interpreter was supposed to automatically translate what she said into Middle English, but Mr. Downworthy had insisted she memorize her first speeches. She and Mr. Latimer had worked on the pronunciation all yesterday afternoon. "Hope and may for ye half bane, ye Robin be Felthavis." She considered falling down on the road, but now that she was out in the open, she could see it was even later than she'd guessed. Nearly sundown, and if she was going to see what lay at the top of the hill, she had better do it now first though. She needed to mark the rendezvous with some kind of sign. There was nothing distinctive about any of the willows. Along the road she looked for a rock to lay at the spot where she could still glimpse the wagon, but there wasn't a sign of one in the rough weeds at the edge of the road. Finally she clambered back through the thicket, catching her hair and her cloak on the willow branches, got the little brass-bound casket that was a copy of one in the Ishmaelian, and carried it back to the side of the road. It wasn't perfect. It was small enough for someone passing by to carry off, but she was only going as far as the top of the hill. If she decided to walk to the nearest village, she'd come back and make a more permanent sign, and there weren't going to be any passers-by. Anytime soon, the steep sides of the ruts were frozen hard. The leaves were undisturbed, and the skim of ice in the puddles was unbroken. Nobody had been on the road all day, all week maybe. She straightened weeds up around the chest, and then started up the hill. The road, except for the frozen mud hole at the bottom, was smoother than Kivrin had expected and pounded flat, which meant horses used it a good deal. In spite of its empty look, it was an easy climb. But Kevin felt tired before she'd gone even a few steps, and her temple began to throb again. She hoped her time lag symptoms wouldn't get worse. She could already see that. She was a long way from anywhere. Or maybe that was just an illusion. She still hadn't ascertained her exact temporal location, and this lane, this wood, had nothing about them that said positively 1320. The only signs of civilization at all were those ruts, which meant she could be in any time, after the invention of the wheel and before paved roads. And not even definitely. Then there were still lanes exactly like this, not 5 miles from Oxford, lovingly preserved by the National Trust for the Japanese and American tourists. She might not have gone anywhere at all, and on the other side of this hill, she would find the M1 or Miss Montoya's dig, or an SDI installation. I would hate to ascertain my temporal location by being struck by a bicycle or an automobile, she thought, and stepped gingerly to the side of the road. But if I haven't gone anywhere, why do I have this wretched headache and feel like I can't walk another step? She reached the top of the hill and stopped out of breath. There was no need to have gotten out of the road. No car had been driven along it as yet, or horse and buggy either. And she was, as she had thought, a long way from anywhere. There weren't any trees here, and she could see for miles. The wood the wagon was in came halfway up the hill, and then straggled south and west for a long way. If she had come through farther into the trees, she would have been lost. There were trees far to the east too, following a river, that she could catch occasional silver, blue glimpses of the Thames, the Cherwell, and little clumps and lines and blobs of trees, dotting all the country between. More trees than she could imagine ever having been in England. The Doomsday Book in 1086 had reported no more than 15% of the land wooded, and probability had estimated that lands cleared for fields and settlements would have reduced that to 12%. By the 1300s, all the men who had written the Doomsday Book had underestimated the numbers badly. There were trees everywhere. Kivrin couldn't see any villages. The woods were bare, their branches gray-black in the late afternoon light, and she should be able to see the churches and manor houses through them. But she couldn't see anything that looked like a settlement. There had to be settlements though, because there were fields, and they were narrow, strip fields that were definitely medieval. There were sheep in one of the fields, and that was medieval too, but you couldn't see anyone tending them. Far off to the east, there was a square gray blur that had to be Oxford. Squinting, she was almost able to make out the walls and the squat shape of Carfax Tower, though she couldn't see any sign of the towers of St. Frigtweed or Osney in the fading light. The light was definitely fading. The sky up here was a pale, bluish lavender, with a hint of pink near the western horizon, and she wasn't turned around, because even while she had stood here, it had gotten darker. Kevin crossed herself and then folded her hands in prayer, bringing her steepled fingers close to her face. Well, Mr. Dunworthy, I'm here. I seem to be in the right place. More or less, I'm not right on the Oxford-Bart Road. I am about 500 yards south of it on a side road. I can see Oxford. It looks like it's 10 miles away. She gave her estimate of what season and time of day it was. and described what she thought she could see. And then stopped and pressed her face against her hands. She should tell the Doomsday Book what she intended to do. But she didn't know what that was. There should be a dozen villages on the rolling plain west of Oxford, but she couldn't see any of them, even though the cultivated fields that belonged to them were there, and the road, there was no one on the road. It curved down the other side of the hill and disappeared immediately into a thick copse. But half a mile farther on was the highway, where the drop should have landed her, wide and flat and pale green. And where this road obviously LED, there was no one on the highway, for as far as she could see, off to her left, and halfway across the plain toward Oxford, she caught a glimpse of distant movement, but it was only a line of cows, heading home to a huddle of trees that must hide a village. It wasn't the village Miss Montoya had wanted her to look for. Skengate was south of the highway, unless she was in the wrong place altogether. And she wasn't. That was definitely Oxford there to the east, and the Thames curving away south of it, down to the brownish-gray haze. That had to be London. But none of that told her where the village was. It might be between here and the highway, just out of sight, or it might be back the other way, or on another side road or path altogether. There was no time to go and see. It was rapidly getting darker. In another half hour there might be lights to go by. But she couldn't afford to wait. The pink had already darkened to lavender in the west, and the blue overhead was almost purple. And it was getting colder. The wind was picking up. The folds of her cloak flapped behind her, and she pulled it tighter around her. She didn't want to spend a December night in a forest, with a splitting headache and a pack of wolves. But she didn't want to spend it lying out on the cold, looking highway either, hoping for someone to come along. She could start for Oxford, but there was no way she could reach it before dark. If she could just see a village, any village, she could spend the night there and look for Miss Montoya's village later. She looked back down the road. She'd come up trying to catch a glimpse of light, or smoke from a hearth or something, but there wasn't anything. Her teeth began to chatter and the bells began to ring. The Carfax bell first sounding just like it always had, even though it must have been cast at least 3 times since 13, and then before the first stroke had died away. The others, as if they'd been waiting for a signal from Oxford. They were ringing vespers, of course, calling the people in from the fields, beckoning them to stop work and come to prayers, and telling her where the villages were. The bells were chiming almost in unison, yet she could hear each one separately. Some so distant only the final, deeper echo reached her. There along that line of trees, and there. The village the cows were heading to was there, behind that low ridge. The cows began to walk faster at the sound of the bell. There were 2 villages practically under her nose. One just the other side of the highway, the other several fields away, next to the little tree-lined stream, Skengate. Miss Montoya's village lay where she thought it did, back the way she had come, past the frozen ruts and over the low hill. Not more than 2 miles. Kevin clasped her hands. "I just found out where the village is," she said, wondering if the sounds of the bells would make it onto the Doomsday Book. "It's on this side road. I'm going to go fetch the wagon and drag it out onto the road, and then I'm going to stagger into the village before it gets dark and collapse on somebody's doorstep." One of the bells was far away to the southwest, and so faint she could scarcely hear it. She wondered if it was the bell she had heard earlier, and why it had been ringing. Maybe Dunworthy was right, and it was a funeral. "I'm all right, Mr. Dunworthy," She said into her hands, "Don't worry about me. I've been here over an hour. And nothing bad has happened so far." The bells died away slowly. The bell from Oxford leading the way again. Though impossibly its sound, hung longer on the air than any of the others. The sky turned violet blue, and a star came out in the southeast. Kevin's hands were still folded in prayer. "It's beautiful here." Transcript from the Doomsday Book. "Well, Mr. Dunworthy, I'm here. I seem to be in the right place. More or less, I'm not right on the Oxford-Bart Road. I'm about 500 yards south of it on a side road. I can see Oxford. It's about 10 miles away. I don't know exactly when I came through, but if it was noon as scheduled, there's been about 4 hours slippage. It's the right time of year. The leaves are mostly off the trees, but the ones on the ground are still more or less intact, and only about a third of the fields have been plowed under. I won't be able to tell my exact temporal location until I reach the village and can ask someone what day it is. You probably know more about where and when I am than I do. Or at least you will after you've done the fix, but I know I'm in the right century. I can see fields from the little hill I'm on. They're classic medieval strip. Fields with the rounded ends where the oxen turn. The pastures are bounded with hedges, and about a third of them are Saxon dead hedges, while the rest are Norman. Hawthorne probability put the ratio in 13 at 25 to 75%, but that was based on Suffolk, which is farther east. To the south and west is forest. Wiswood all deciduous as far as I can tell. To the east I can see the Thames. I can almost see London. Even though I know that's impossible, in 1320 it would have been over 50 miles away. Wouldn't it instead of only 20? I still think I can see it. I can definitely see the city walls of Oxford and Carfax Tower. It's beautiful here. It doesn't feel as though I was 700 years away from you. Oxford is right there within walking distance, and I cannot get the idea out of my head that if I walked down this hill and into town, I would find all of you still standing there in the lab. At Brasenose waiting for the fix, Badri frowning at the displays, and Miss Montoya fretting to get back to her dig, and you, Mr. Dunworthy, clucking like an old mother hen. I don't feel separated from you at all, or even very far away. Chapter 4. Baudry's hand came away from his forehead as he fell, and his elbow hit the console and broke his fall for a second. And Dunworthy glanced anxiously at the screen, afraid he might have hit one of the keys, and scramble the display. Baudry crumpled to the floor. Latimer and Gilchrist didn't try to grab him either. Latimer didn't even seem to realize anything had gone wrong. Mary grabbed for Baudry immediately, but she was standing behind the others and only caught a fold of his sleeve. She was instantly on her knees beside him, straightening them out onto his back and jamming an earphone into her ear. She rummaged in her shopping bag, came up with a bleeper, and held the call button down for a full 5 seconds. Badri, she said loudly, and it was only then that Dunworthy realized how deathly silent it was in the room. Gilchrist was standing where he had been when Baudry fell. He looked furious. I assure you, we've considered every possible contingency. He obviously hadn't considered this one. Mary let go of the bleeper button and shook Baudry's shoulders gently. There was no response. She tilted his head far back and bent over his face, her ear practically in his open mouth, and her head turned so she could see his chest. He hadn't stopped breathing. Dunworthy could see his chest rising and falling, and Mary obviously could too. She raised her head immediately, already pressing on the bleeper, and pressed her fingers against the side of his neck, held them there for what seemed an endless time, and then raised the bleeper to her mouth. We're at Brasenose in the history laboratory. She said into the bleeper, 5 to collapse syncope. No evidence of seizure. She took her hand off the call. Button and pulled Budray's eyelids up. Syncoop Gilchrist said, "What's that?" "What happened?" She glanced irritably at him. "He's fainted," she said. "Get me my kit," she said to Dunworthy in the shopping bag. She had knocked the bag over, getting the bleeper out. It lay on its side. Dunworthy fumbled through the boxes and parcels, found a hard plastic box that looked the right size, and snapped it open. It was full of red and green foil Christmas crackers. He jammed it back in the bag. "Come along," Mary said. "I'm buttoning Battery's lab shirt." "I haven't got all day." "No, I can't find." Dunworthy began. She snatched the bag away and appended it. The crackers rolled everywhere. The box with the muffler came open, and the muffler fell out. Mary grabbed up her handbag, zipped it open, and pulled out a large flat kit. She opened it and took out a tack bracelet. She fastened the bracelet around Battery's wrist and turned to look at the blood pressure reads on the kit's monitor. The waveform didn't tell Dunworthy anything, and he couldn't tell from Mary's reaction what she thought it meant, but Dre hadn't stopped breathing. His heart hadn't stopped beating, and he wasn't bleeding, anywhere that Dunworthy could see. Perhaps he had only fainted. But people didn't simply fall over. Except in books or the vids, he must be injured or ill. He had seemed to be almost in shock when he came into the pub. Could he have been struck by a bicycle, like the one that had just missed hitting Dunworthy, and not realized at first that he was injured? That would account for his disconnected manner, his peculiar agitation, but not for the fact that he had come away without his coat, that he had said, "I need you to come," that he had said, "There's something wrong." Dunworthy turned and looked at the console screen. It still showed the matrices it had when the tech collapsed. He couldn't read them, but it looked like a normal fix. And Badri had said Kivrin had gone through. "All right, there's something wrong." With her hands flat, Mary was patting Bardry's arms, the sides of his chest, down his legs. Bardry's eyelids fluttered, and then his eyes closed again. "Do you know if Badri had any health problems?" "His Mr. Dunworthy's tech," Gilchrist said accusingly from Belio. "It was on loan to us," he added, making it sound like Dunworthy was somehow responsible for this. Had arranged the tech's collapse to sabotage the project. "I don't know of any health problems." Dunworthy said he'd have had a full screen and seasonals at the start of term. Mary looked dissatisfied. She put on her stethoscope and listened to his heart for a long minute, rechecked the blood pressure reads, took his pulse again. "And you don't know anything of a history of epilepsy, diabetes?" "No," Dunworthy said. "Has he ever used drugs or illegal endorphins?" She didn't wait for him to answer. She pressed the button on her bleeper again. "Aaron's here, pulse 1. 10 BP 100/60. I'm doing a blood screen." She tore open a gauze wipe, swabbed at the arm without the bracelet, tore open another packet. "Drugs or illegal endorphins." That would account for his agitated manner, his disconnected speech, but if he used, it would have shown up on the beginning of term screen. And he couldn't possibly have worked the elaborate calculations of the net. If he was using, there's something wrong. Mary swabbed at the arm again and slid a cannula under the skin. Battery's eyes fluttered open. "Boudreaux," Mary said. "Can you hear me?" She reached in her coat pocket and produced a bright red capsule. "I need to give you your temp," she said, and held it to his lips. But he didn't give any indication he'd heard. She put the capsule back in her pocket and began rummaging in the kit. "Tell me when the reads come up on that cannula," she said to Dunworthy, taking everything out of the kit and then putting it back in. She laid the kit down and started through her handbag. "I thought I had a skin temp thermometer with me," she said. "The readings are up," Dunworthy said. Mary picked her bleeper up and began reading the numbers into it. Butry opened his eyes. "You have to," he said, and closed them again. "So cold," he murmured. Dunworthy took off his overcoat, but it was too wet to lay over him. He looked helplessly around the room for something to cover him with. If this had happened before Kivrin left, they could have used that blanket of a cloak she'd been wearing. Dree's jacket was wadded underneath the console. Dunworthy laid it sideways over him, freezing. Melodry murmured and began to shiver. Mary, still reciting Rees into the bleeper, looked sharply across at him. What did he say? But Dree murmured something else and then said clearly, "Headache, headache." Mary said, "Do you feel nauseated?" He moved his head a little to indicate no. "When was?" he said, and clutched at her arm. She put her hand over his, frowned and pressed her other hand to his forehead. "He's got a fever," she said. "There's something wrong." Padre said, and closed his eyes. His hand let go of her arm and dropped back to the floor. Mary picked his limp arm up, looked at the reeds and felt his forehead again. "Where's that damn skin temp?" she said, and began rummaging through the kit again. The bleeper chimed. "They're here," she said. "Somebody go show them the way in." She patted Barry's chest. "Just lie still." They were already at the door when Dunworthy opened it. Two medics from infirmary pushed through, carrying kits the size of steamer trunks. "Immediate transport," Mary said. Before they could get the trunks open, she got up off her knees. "Fetch the stretcher," she said to the female medic, "and get me a skin temp and a sucrose drip. I assume 20th century's personnel have been screened for dwarfs and drugs," Gilchrist said. One of the medics knocked past him with a pump feed. Medieval would never allow. He stepped out of the way as the other one came in with a stretcher. "Is this a drug over the mail?" Medic said, glancing at Gilchrist. "No." Mary said, "Did you bring the skin temp?" "We don't have one," he said, plugging the feed into the shunt. "Just a thermostat and tongue. We'll have to wait till we get him in." He held the plastic bag over his head for a minute, till the grab feed kicked the motor on, and then taped the bag to Bardry's chest. The female medic took the jacket off Bardry and covered him with a gray blanket. "Cold," Bardry said. "You have to." "What do I have to do?" Dunworthy said. The fix 1-0 to the medic said in unison, and rolled him onto the stretcher. "James, Mr. Gilchrist, I'll need you to come to hospital with me to fill out his admission forms," Mary said, "and I'll need his medical history. One of you can come in the ambulance, and the other follow." Dunworthy didn't wait to argue with Gilchrist over which of them should ride in the ambulance. He clambered in and up next to Bardry, who was breathing hard as if being carried on. The stretcher had been too much exertion. "Battery," he said urgently. "You said something was wrong. Did you mean something went wrong with the fix?" "I got the fix," Battery said, frowning. The male medic, attaching Dree to a daunting array of displays, looked irritated. "Did the apprentice get the coordinates wrong?" "It's important, Dree. Did he make an error in the remote coordinates?" Mary climbed into the ambulance as acting ahead. "I feel I should be the one to accompany the patient." In the ambulance, Dunworthy heard Gilchrist say, "Meet us in casualties at infirmary," Mary said, and pulled the doors to. "Have you got a temp yet?" she asked the medic. "Yep," he said. 39.5 CBP, 90/55, pulse 115. "Was there an error in the coordinates?" Dunworthy said to Bardry, "Are you set back there?" The driver said over the intercom, "Yes." Mary said, "Code 1. Did Pavlovsky make an error in the locational coordinates for the remote?" "No," Bedry said. He grabbed at the lapel of Dunworthy's coat. "Is it the slippage then I must have?" Badri said, so worried. The sirens blared, drowning out the rest of what he said. "You must have what?" Dunworthy shouted over their up and down klaxon. "Something wrong," Driss said, and fainted again. Something wrong. It had to be the slippage. Except for the coordinates. It was the only thing that could go wrong with a drop that wouldn't abort it. And he had said the locational coordinates were right. How much slippage, though? Padre had told him it might be as much as 2 weeks, and he wouldn't have run all the way to the pub in the pouring rain without his coat, unless it was much more than that. How much more? A month, 3 months, but he told Gilchrist. The preliminaries showed minimal slippage. Mary elbowed past him and put her hand on Padre's forehead again. Add sodium thiocyanate to the drip, she said, and started WBC screen. James, get out of the way. Down where the edge past Mary, and sat down on the bench. Near the back of the ambulance, Mary picked up her bleeper again. Stand by for a full CBC and serotyping. Pile on the frights, the medic said, watching the reads change. BP 96/60, pulse 120, temp 39.5. I don't think so, Mary said. There's no apparent abdominal pain, but it's obviously an infection of some sort with that temp. The sirens dived suddenly down in frequency and stopped. The medic began pulling wires out of the wall hookups. We're here, Badri, Mary said, patting his chest again. We'll soon have you right as rain. He gave no indication he had heard. Mary pulled the blanket up to his neck and arranged the dangling wires on top of it. The driver yanked the door open, and they slid the stretcher out. I want a full blood workup, Mary said, holding onto the door. As she climbed down CF, HI, and antigenic ID, Dunworthy clambered down after her and followed her into the casualties department. I need a med hist, she was already telling the registrar on Badri. What's his last name? James Chad Hooley. He said. National Health Service number, the registrar asked. I don't know, he said. He works at Balliol. Would you be so good as to spell the name for me, please? CHA, he said. Mary was disappearing into casualties. He started after her. I'm sorry, sir, the registrar said, darting up from her console to block his way. If you'll just be seated, I must talk to the patient you just admitted. He said. Are you a relative? No, he said. I'm his employer. It's very important. He's in an examining cubicle just now. She said. I'll ask for permission for you to see him as soon as the examination is completed. She sat gingerly back down at the console, as if ready to leap up again. At the slightest movement on his part, Dunworthy thought of simply barging in on the examination. But he didn't want to risk being barred from hospital altogether, and at any rate, Badri was in no condition to talk. He had been clearly unconscious when they took him out of the ambulance. Unconscious and with a fever of 39.5, something wrong. The registrar was looking suspiciously up at him. Would you mind terribly giving me that spelling again? He spelled Childhory for her, and then asked where he could find a telephone. Just down the corridor, she said. Age? I don't know, he said. 25. He's been at Burial for years. He answered the rest of her questions as best he could, and then looked out the door to see if Gilchrist had come, and went down the corridor to the telephones and rang up Brasenose. He got the porter, who was decorating an artificial Christmas tree that stood on the lodge counter. I need to speak to Pahowski, Dunworthy said, hoping that was the name of the first-year tech. He's not here, the porter said, draping a silver garland over the branches with his free hand. Well, as soon as he returns, please tell him I need to speak with him. It's very important. I need him to read a fix for me. I'm at. Dunworthy waited pointedly for the porter to finish arranging the garland and write the number of the call box down, which he finally did, scribbling it on the lid of a box of ornaments. If he can't reach me at this number, have him ring the casualties department at infirmary. How soon will he return, you think? That's difficult to say, the porter said, unwrapping an angel. Some of them come back a few days early, but most of them don't show up until the first day of term. What do you mean? Isn't he staying in college? He was going to run the net for Muddy Evil, but when he found he wasn't needed, he went home. I need his home address then and his telephone number. It's somewhere in Wales, I believe, but You'd have to talk to the college secretary for that. And she's not here just now either. When will she be back? I can't say, sir. She went to London to do a bit of Christmas shopping, Dan Worthy gave another message, while the porter straightened the angel's wings, and then ran off and tried to think if there were any other texts. In Oxford for Christmas, clearly not, or Gilchrist wouldn't have used a first-year apprentice. In the first place, he put a call through to Maudlin anyway. But got no answer. He rang off, thought a minute, and then rang up Beryl. There was no answer there either. Finch must still be out, showing the American bell ringers. The bells at Great Tom. He looked at his digital. It was only 2:30. It seemed much later. They might only be at lunch. He rang up the phone in Bellairs Hall, but still got no answer. He went back into the waiting area, expecting Gilchrist to be there. He wasn't, but the two medics were talking to a staff nurse. Gilchrist had probably gone back to Brasenose to plot his next drop or the one after that. Perhaps he'd send Kevin straight into the Black Death, the third time round for direct observation. "There you are," the staff nurse said. "I was afraid you'd left. If you'll just come with me." Dunworthy had assumed she was speaking to him, but the medics followed her out the door too, and down a corridor. "Here we are then," she said, holding a door open for them. The medics filed through. "There's tea on the trolley, and AWC just through there. When will I be able to see Madame de la Huari?" Dunworthy asked, holding the door so she couldn't shut it. "Dr. Ahrens will be with you directly," she said, and shut the door in spite of him. The female medic had already slouched down in a chair, her hands in her pockets. The man was over by the tea trolley, plugging in the electric kettle. Neither of them had asked the registrar any questions on the way down the corridor, so perhaps this was routine, though down there they couldn't imagine why they would want to see Bardrell, or why they had all been brought here. This waiting room was in an entirely different wing from the casualties ward. It had the same spine, destroying chairs of the waiting room in casualties, the same tables with inspirational pamphlets fanned out on them, the same foil garland draped over the tea trolley and secured with bunches of plastic holly. There were no windows though, not even in the door. It was self-contained and private, the sort of room where people waited for bad news. Dunworthy sat down, suddenly tired. Bad news, an infection of some sort. BP 96, pulse 120, temp 39.5, the only other tech in Oxford. Off in Wales, and Bosingami's secretary, out doing her Christmas shopping. And Kevin somewhere in 20 days or even weeks from where she was supposed to be, or months. The male medic poured milk and sugar into a cup and stirred it, waiting for the electric kettle to heat. The woman appeared to have gone to sleep. Dunworthy stared at her, thinking about the slippage. Bardray had said the preliminary calculations indicated minimal slippage, but they were only preliminary. Bardray had told him. He thought 2 weeks slippage was likely, and that made sense. The farther back the historian was sent, the greater the average slippage. 20th century's drops usually had only a few minutes. 18th century's a few hours. Maudlin, which was still running on Mans to the Renaissance, was getting slippage off from 3 to 6 days. But those were only averages. The slippage varied from person to person, and it was impossible to predict for any given drop. 19th century had had one off by 48 days, and in uninhabited areas, there was often no slippage at all, and often the amount seemed arbitrary, whimsical. When they'd run the first slippage checks for 20th century back in the 20s, he'd stood in Balia's empty quad and been sent through to 2AM on September 14, 1956, with only 3 minutes slippage. But when they sent him through again at 2:08, there had been nearly 2 hours, and he'd come through nearly on top of an undergraduate sneaking in after a night out. Kevin might be 6 months from where she was supposed to be, with no idea of when the rendezvous was. And Badri had come running to the pub to tell him to pull her out. Mary came in still wearing her coat. Dunworthy stood up. "Is it Bardelli?" he asked. Afraid of the answer. "He's still in casualties," she said. "We need his NHS number, and we can't find his records in Belial's file." Her gray hair was mussed again, but otherwise she seemed as businesslike as she was. When she discussed Dunworthy's students with him, "He is not a member of the college," Dunworthy said, feeling relieved. Techs are assigned to the individual colleges, but they're officially employed by the university. Then his records would be in the registrar's office. "Good. Do you know if he's traveled outside England?" In the past month, he did an on-site for 19th century in Hungary. 2 weeks ago, he's been in England since then. Has he had any relations visit him from Pakistan? He hasn't any, he's third generation. Have you found out what he's got? She wasn't listening. Where are Gilchrist and Montoya? She said, "You told Gilchrist to meet us here, but he hadn't come in here yet when I was brought in here, and Montoya. She left as soon as the drop was completed," Dunworthy said. "Have you any idea where she might have gone?" "No more than you have," Dunworthy thought. "You watch her leave too. I assume she went back to Whitney to her dig. She spends the majority of her time there." "Her dig," Mary said as if she'd never heard of it. "What is it?" he thought. "What's wrong in Whitney?" he said. "The National Trust farm. She's excavating a medieval village, Whitney," she said, looking unhappy. "She have to come in immediately." "Should I try to ring her up?" Dunworthy said. But Mary had already gone over to the medics, standing by the tea trolley. "I need you to fetch someone in from Whitney," she said to him. He put down his cup and saucer and shrugged on his jacket. "From the National Trust site. Lupu Montoya." She went out the door with him. He expected her to come back as soon as she'd finished, giving him the directions to Whitney. When she didn't, he started after her. She wasn't in the corridor. Neither was the medic, but the nurse from casualties was. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, barring his path, the way the registrar and casualties had. "Dr. Ahrens asked that you wait for her here. I'm not leaving the infirmary. I need to put a call through to my secretary. I'll be glad to fetch you a phone, sir," she said firmly. She turned and looked down the corridor. Gilchrist and Latimer were coming. "Hope Miss Engel has the opportunity to observe a death," Gilchrist was saying. Attitudes towards death in the 1300s differed greatly from ours. Death was a common and accepted part of life, and the contempts were incapable of feeling loss or grief. "Mr. Dunworthy," the nurse said, tugging at his arm, "if you'll just wait inside, I'll bring you a telephone." She went to meet Gilchrist and Latimer. "If you'll come with me, please," she said, and ushered them into the waiting room. "I'm acting head of the history faculty," Gilchrist said, glaring at Dunworthy. "Bardry Chowdhury is my responsibility." "Yes, sir," the nurse said, shutting the door. "Dr. Ahrens will be with you directly." Latimer set his umbrella on one of the chairs, and Mary's shopping bag on the one next to it. He had apparently retrieved all the parcels Mary had dumped on the floor. Dunworthy could see the muffler box and one of the Christmas crackers sticking out of the top. "We couldn't find a taxi," he said. Breathing hard, he sat down next to his burdens. "We had to take the tube." "Where's the apprentice tech you are going to use?" "On the drop," Perlsky from Dunworthy said. "I need to speak with him concerning what, if I may ask? Or have you taken over medieval entirely in my absence? It's essential that someone read the fix and make sure it's all right." "You'd be delighted if something were to go wrong, wouldn't you? You've been attempting to obstruct this drop from the beginning." "Were to go wrong?" Dunworthy said disbelievingly. "It's already gone wrong. Battery is lying in hospital unconscious, and we don't have any idea if Kivrin is. When or where she's supposed to be, you heard better, he said. Something was wrong with the fix. We've got to get a tech here to find out what it is. I should hardly put any credence in what someone says. Under the influence of drugs, or dwarfs, or whatever it is he's been taking. Gilchrist said, and may I remind you, Mr. Dunworthy, that the only thing to have gone wrong on this drop is 20th century's part in it. Mr. Bohovsky was doing a perfectly adequate job. However, at your insistence, I allowed your tech to replace him. It's obvious I shouldn't have. The door opened, and they all turned and looked at it. The sister brought in a portable telephone, handed it to Dunworthy, and ducked out again. I must ring up Brasenose and tell them where I am, Gilchrist said. Dunworthy ignored him, flipped up the phone's visual screen and rang up Jesus. I need the names and home telephone numbers of your texts, he told the acting principal's secretary when she appeared on the screen. None of them are here over VAC, are they? None of them were there. He wrote down the names and numbers on one of the inspirational pamphlets. Thanked the senior tutor, hung up, and started on the list of numbers. The first number he punched was engaged. The others got him an engaged tone before he'd even finished punching. In the town exchanges, and on the last, a computer voice broke in and said, "All lines are engaged, please attempt your call later." He rang Balio both the hall and his own office. He didn't get an answer at either number. Finch must have taken the Americans to London to hear. Big Ben Gilchrist was still standing next to him, waiting to use the phone. Latimer had wandered over to the tea cart and was trying to plug in the electric kettle. The medic came out of her drowse to assist him. "Have you finished with the telephone?" Gilchrist said stiffly. "No." Dunworthy said and tried Finch again. There was still no answer. He rang off. "I want you to get your tech back to Oxford and pull Kivrin out now, before she's left the drop site. You want," Gilchrist said. "Might I remind you that this is Medieval's drop, not yours. It doesn't matter whose it is," Dunworthy said, trying to keep his temper. "It's university policy to abort a drop. If there's any sort of problem, may I also remind you that the only problem we've encountered on this drop is that you failed to screen your tech for dwarves." He reached for the phone. "I will decide if and when this drop needs to be aborted." The phone rang. "Gilchrist here," Gilchrist said. "Just a moment, please." He handed the telephone to Dunworthy. "Mr. Dunworthy," Finch said, looking harried. "Thank goodness. I've been calling round everywhere. You won't believe the difficulties I've had. I've been detained," Dunworthy said, before Finch could launch into an account of his difficulties. "Now listen carefully. I need you to go and fetch Perdrew Chowdhury's employment file from the bursar's office. Dr. Arns needs it. Ring her up. She's here at infirmary. Insist on speaking directly to her. She tell you what information she wants from the file." "Yes, sir," Finch said, taking up a pad and pencil and taking rapid notes. "As soon as you've done that, I want you to go straight to New College and see the senior tutor. Tell him I must speak with him immediately. And give him this telephone number. Tell him it's an emergency. That it's essential that we locate Basingham. He must come back to Oxford immediately." "Do you think he'll be able to, sir?" "What do you mean?" "Has there been a message from Basingham? Has something happened to him?" "Not that I know, officer." "Well then, of course he'll be able to come back. He's only on a fishing trip. It's not as if he's on a schedule. After you've spoken to the senior tutor, ask any staff and students you can find. Perhaps one of them has an idea as to where Basingham is, and while you're there, find out whether any of their techs are here in Oxford." "Yes, sir," Finch said. "But what should I do with the Americans?" "You'll have to tell them I'm sorry to have missed them, but that I was unavoidably detained. They're supposed to leave for Ellie at 4, aren't they?" "They were, but what?" Well, sir, I took them round to see Great Tom and Old Marston Church and all. But when I tried to take them out to Iffley, we were stopped. Stopped, Downworthy said. By whom? The police, sir. They had barricades up. The thing is, the Americans are very upset about their handbell concert. Barricades, Dunworthy said. Yes, sir, on the A4158. Should I put the Americans up in Salvins? Sir William, Gadsden, and Tom Gailey are on the north staircase. But Buzzavy's been painted. I don't understand. Dunworthy said, why were you stopped to quarantine? Finch said, looking surprised. I could put them in Fisher's. The heat's been turned off for vac. But they could use the fireplaces. Transcript from the Doomsday Book. I'm back at the drop site. It's some distance from the road. I'm going to drag the wagon out onto the road so that my chances of being seen are better. But if no one happens along in the next half hour, I intend to walk to Skengate, which I have located. Thanks to the bells of evening vespers, I am experiencing considerable time lag. My head aches pretty badly and I keep having chills. The symptoms are worse than I understood them to be, from Badri and Dr. Ahrens. The headache particularly. I'm glad the village isn't far. Chapter 5. Quarantine. Of course, Dunworthy thought. The medics sent to fetch Montoir and Mary's questions about Pakistan. And all them put here in this isolated, self-contained room. With a ward sister guarding the door, of course. Will Salvin do then for the Americans? Finch was asking. Did the police say why a quarr he stopped? Gilchrist was watching him. But Dunworthy didn't think he could see the screen from where he was. Latima was fussing over the tea trolley, trying to open a sugar packet. The female medic was asleep. Did the police say why these precautions had been taken? No, sir, only that it was Oxford and immediate environs, and to contact the National Health for instructions. Did you contact them? No, sir. I've been trying. I can't get through. All the trunk lines have been engaged. The Americans have been trying to reach Ellie to cancel their concert, but the lines are jammed. Oxford and environs. That meant they had stopped the tube as well. And the bullet train to London, as well as blocking all the roads. No wonder the lines were jammed. How long ago was this when you went out to Iffley? It was a bit after 3, sir. I've been phoning round since then trying to find you. And then I thought perhaps he knows about it already. I rang up infirmary. And then started calling round to all the hospitals. I didn't know about it already, Dunworthy thought. He tried to recall the conditions required for calling a quarantine. The original regulations had required it in every case of unidentified disease or suspicion of contagion, but those had been passed in the first hysteria after the pandemic, and they had been amended and watered down every few years. Since then till Dunworthy had no idea what they were. Now, he did know that a few years ago, they'd been absolute identification of dangerous, infectious disease because there'd been a fuss in the papers. When Lassa fever had raged unchecked for 3 weeks, in a town in Spain, the local doctors hadn't done viral typing, and the whole mess had resulted in a push to put teeth in the regulations. But he had no idea if they'd gone through. Should I assign them rooms in Salvin then? Sir Finch asked again. Yes, no. Put them in the junior common room for now. They can practice their changes, or whatever it is they do. Get Badri's file and phone it in, if the lines are all engaged. You'd best phone it in to this number. I'll be here even if Dr. Ahrens isn't, and then find out about Basingham. It's more important than ever that we locate him. You can assign the Americans rooms later. They're very upset, sir. So am I, Dunworthy thought. Tell the Americans. I'll find out what I can about the situation and ring you back. He watched the screen go gray. You can't wait to inform Basingham of what you perceive to be Medieval's failure, can you? Gilchrist said. In spite of the fact that it was your tech who has jeopardized this drop by using drugs, A fact of which you may be sure. I will inform Mr. Basingham on his return." Dan Worthy looked at his digital. It was 4:30. Finch had said they'd been stopped at a bit after 3, an hour and a half. Oxford had only had to temp quarantines in recent years. One had turned out to be an allergic reaction to an injection, and the other one had turned out to be nothing at all. A schoolgirl prank. Both had been called off as soon as they had the results of the blood tests, and those hadn't taken even a quarter of an hour. Mary had taken blood in the ambulance. Downworthy had seen the medic hand the vials to the house officer. When they came into casualties, there had been ample time for them to obtain the results. "I'm certain Mr. Basingame will also be interested in hearing that it was your failure to have your text screened that's resulted in this drop being jeopardized," Gilchrist said. Dunworthy should have recognized the symptoms as those of an infection, Battery's low blood pressure, his labored breathing, his elevated temp. Mary had even said in the ambulance that it had to be an infection of some kind, with his temp that high. But he had assumed she meant a localized infection. Staph or an inflamed appendix, and what disease could it be? Smallpox and typhoid have been eradicated back in the 20th century, and polio in this one. Bacterials didn't have a chance against antibody specification, and the antivirals work so well. Nobody even had colds anymore. It seems distinctly odd that, after being so concerned about the precautions Medieval was taking, that you wouldn't take the obvious precaution of screening your tech for drugs, Gilchrist said. It must be a third world disease. Mary had asked all those questions about whether Battery had been out of the community, about his Pakistani relatives. But Pakistan wasn't third world. Umberdry couldn't have gone out of the community without a whole series of inoculations. And he hadn't gone outside the EC except for the Hungarian on site. He'd been in England all term. "I would like to use the telephone," Gilchrist was saying. "I quite agree that we need Basingham here to take matters in hand." Downworthy was still holding the phone. He blinked at it, surprised. "Do you mean to prevent me from phoning Basingham?" Gilchrist said. Latimer stood up. "What is it?" he said, his arms held out, as if he thought Downworthy might pitch forward into them. "What's wrong?" "Battery isn't using," Dunworthy said to Gilchrist. "He's ill." "I fail to see how you can claim to know that without having run a screen," Gilchrist said, looking pointedly at the phone. "We're under quarantine," Dunworthy said. "It's some sort of infectious disease. It's a virus," Mary said from the door. "We don't have it sequenced yet, but the preliminary results ID it as a viral infection." She had unbuttoned her coat, and it flapped behind her like a kiver's cloak. As she hurried into the room, she was carrying a lab tray by the handle. It was piled high with equipment and paper packets. "The tests indicate that it's probably a mix of virus," she said, setting the tray down on one of the end tables. "Boudreaux's symptoms are compatible with that. High fever, disorientation, headache. It's definitely not a retrovirus or a pecavirus, which is good news, but it will be some time yet before we have a complete ID." She pulled the chairs up next to the table and sat down on one. "We've notified the World Influenza Center in London and sent them samples for ident and sequencing. Until we have a positive ID, a tent quarantine has been called, as required by NHS regulations, in cases of possible epidemic conditions." She pulled on a pair of Imperium gloves. "Epidemic," Gilchrist said, shooting a furious glance at Dunworthy, as if accusing him of engineering the quarantine to discredit Medieval. "Possible epidemic conditions," Mary corrected, tearing open paper packets. "There's no epidemic as yet. Badri's is the only case so far. We've run a community computer check, and there have been no other cases with Badri's profile, which is also good news. How can he have a viral infection?" Gilchrist said, still glaring at Dunworthy. "I suppose." Mr. Dunworthy didn't bother to check for that either. Verdries, an employee of the university. Mary said he should have had the usual start of term. Physical and antivirals. "You don't know," Gilchrist said. "The registrar's office is closed for Christmas." She said, "I haven't been able to reach the registrar, and I can't call up Bardry's files without his NHS number. I've sent my secretary to our bursar's office to see if we have hard copies of the university's files." Dunworthy said we should at the least have his number. "Good," Mary said. "We'll be able to tell a good deal more about the sort of virus we're dealing with when we know what antivirals Bardry's had and how recently. He may have a history of anomalous reactions. And there's also a chance he's Mr. Seasonal. Do you happen to know his religion?" Mr. Dunworthy, is he new Hindu? Dunworthy shook his head. "His Church of England," he said, knowing what Mary was getting at. The new Hindus believed that all life was sacred, including killed viruses, if killed was the right word. They refused to have any inoculations or vaccines. The university gave them waivers on religious grounds, but didn't allow them to live in college. Padres had his starter term clearance. He'd never have been allowed to work the net without it. Mary nodded, as if she had already come to that conclusion. "As I said, this is very likely an anomaly." Gilchrist started to say something, but stopped when the door opened. The nurse who had been guarding the door came in, wearing a mask and gown and carrying pencils and a sheaf of papers in her impromptu gloved hands. "As a precaution, we need to test those people who have been in contact with the patient. For antibodies, we'll need blood and tongue. And we need each of you to list all of your contacts and those of Mr. Chud Hori." The nurse handed several sheets of paper and a pencil to Dunworthy. The top sheet was in a hospital admissions form. The one underneath was headed primaries and divided into columns marked name, location, time. The bottom sheet was just the same, except that it was headed secondaries, since Bardry is our only case. Mary said, "We are considering him the index case. We do not have a positive mode of transmission yet. So you must list anyone who's had any contact with Boudreaux, however momentary. Anyone you spoke to, touched, has had any contact with." Dunworthy had a sudden image of Bardra leaning over Kivrin, adjusting her sleeve, moving her arm. "Anyone at all who may have been exposed," Mary said. "Including all of us." The medic said. "Yes," Mary said. And Kevin, Dunworthy said. For a moment, she looked like she had no idea at all who Kevin was. "Miss Engel has had full spectrum antivirals and T-cell enhancement." Gilchrist said she would not be at risk. "Would she?" Dr. Ahrens hesitated only a second. "No, she didn't have any contact with Battery before this morning, did she? Mr. Dunworthy only offered me the use of his tech 2 days ago," Gilchrist said, practically snatching the papers and pencil. The nurse was offering him out of her hands. "I, of course, assumed that Mr. Dunworthy had taken the same precautions with his text. Which medieval had it has become apparent, however, that he didn't, and you may be sure. I will inform Babington of your negligence, Mr. Dunworthy. If Kevin's first contact with Bardry was this morning, she was fully protected," Mary said. "Mr. Gilchrist, if you'd be so good." She indicated the chair, and he came and sat down. Mary took one of the sets of papers from the nurse and held up the sheet marked primaries. "Any person Padre had contact with is a primary contact. Any person you have had contact with is a secondary. On this sheet, I would like you to list all contacts you have had with Bardrick Chowdhury over the last 3 days, and any contacts of his that you know of." On this sheet, she held up the sheet marked secondaries. "List all your contacts with the time you had them. Begin with the present and work backward." She popped a tamp in Gilchrist's mouth, peeled a portable monitor off its paper strip, and stuck it on his wrist. The nurse passed the papers out to Latimer, and the medic. Dunworthy sat down and began filling out his own. The infirmary form asked for his name, National Health Service number, and a complete medical history, which the NHS number could, no doubt, call up in better detail than he could remember it. Illnesses, surgeries, inoculations. If Mary didn't have Padri's NHS number, that meant he was still unconscious. Mary took one of the sets of papers from the nurse and held up the sheet marked primaries. Any person Padri had contact with is a primary contact. Any person you have had contact with is a secondary. On this sheet, I would like you to list all contacts you have had with Bardrick Chowdhury over the last 3 days, and any contacts of his that you know of on this sheet. She held up the sheet marked secondaries. List all your contacts with the time you had them. Begin with the present and work backward. She popped a tamp into Gilchrist's mouth, peeled a portable monitor off its paper strip, and stuck it on his wrist. The nurse passed the papers out to Latimer and the medic. Dunworthy sat down and began filling out his own. The infirmary form asked for his name, National Health Service number, and a complete medical history, which the NHS number could, no doubt, call up in better detail than he could remember it. Illnesses, surgeries, inoculations. If Mary didn't have Padri's NHS number, that meant he was still unconscious. Dunworthy had no idea what date his last start of term antivirals had been. He put question marks next to them, turned to the primary sheet, and wrote his own name at the top of the column. Latimer Gilchrist. The two medics, he didn't know their names, and the female medic was asleep again. She held her papers bunched in one hand, her arms folded across her chest. Dunworthy wondered if he needed to list the doctors and nurses who had worked on Badri when he came in. He wrote casualties department staff and then put a question mark after it. Montoya and Kivrin, who according to Mary was fully protected. Something's wrong, Battery had said. Had he meant this infection? Had he realized he was getting ill while he was trying to get the fix and come running to the pub to tell them? He had exposed Kevin, the pub. There hadn't been anyone in the pub except the barman and Finch, but he'd gone before Bardray got there. Dunworthy lifted up the sheet and wrote Fincher's name under secondaries, and then turned back to the first sheet and wrote Barman, Lamb, and Cross. The pub had been empty, but the streets hadn't been. He could see Bardry in his mind's eye, pushing his way through the Christmas crowd, barging into the woman with the lavender flowered umbrella, and elbowing his way past the old man and the little boy with the white terrier. Anyone he's had any contact with, Mary had said. He looked across at Mary, who was holding Gilchrist's wrists and making careful entries in a chart. Was she going to try to get Bloods and Tong from everyone on these lists? It was impossible. Bardry had touched or brushed past or breathed on dozens of people in his headlong flight back to Brasenose, none of whom Dunworthy or Bardry would recognize again. Doubtless he had come in contact with as many or more on his way to the pub, and each of them had come in contact with how many others in the busy shops? He wrote down large number of shoppers and pedestrians. High Street ? Drew a line and tried to remember the other occasions on which he'd seen Barry. He hadn't asked him to run the net until 2 days ago, when he'd found out from Kivrin that Gilchrist was intending to use a first-year apprentice. Buttrey had just gotten back from London. When Dunworthy telephoned, Kivrin had been in hospital that day for her final examination, which was good. She couldn't have had any contact with him then, and he'd been in London before that. Tuesday, Bardry had come to see Dunworthy to tell him he'd checked the first year students' coordinates and done a full systems check. Dunworthy hadn't been there, so he'd left a note. Kivrin had come to Bela Tuesday as well. to show him her costume, but that had been in the morning. Bidri had said in his note that he'd spent all morning at the net, and Kevin had said she was going to see Latimer at the Bodleian in the afternoon, but she might have gone back to the net after that, or have been there before she came to show him her costume. The door opened and the nurse ushered Montoya in. Her terrorist jacket and jeans were wet. It must still be raining. "What's going on?" she said to Mary, who was labeling a vial of Gilchrist's blood. "It seems," Gilchrist said, pressing a wad of cotton wool to the inside of his arm and standing up, "that Mr. Dunworthy failed to have his tech properly checked for inoculations before he ran the net. And now he's in hospital with a temperature of 39.5. He apparently has some sort of exotic fever." "Fever?" Montoya said, looking bewildered. "Isn't 39.5 low? It's 103 degrees in Fahrenheit." Mary said, sliding the vial into its carrier. "Badri's infection is possibly contagious. I need to run some tests. And you'll need to write down all of your contacts and Badri's." "Okay," Montoya said. She sat down in the chair Gilchrist had vacated and shrugged off her jacket. Mary swabbed the inside of her arm and clipped a new vial of disposable punch together. "Let's get it over with. I've got to get back to my dig." "You can't go back," Gilchrist said. "Haven't you heard we're under quarantine?" "Thanks to Mr. Dunworthy's carelessness. Quarantine," she said, and jerked so the punch missed her arm completely. The idea of a disease she might contract had not infected her at all. But the mention of a quarantine, that I have to get back. She said, appealing to Mary, "You mean I have to stay here until we have the blood test results?" Mary said, trying to find a vein for the punch. "How long will that be?" Montoya said, trying to look at her digital. "With the arm Mary was working on, the guy who brought me in didn't even let me cover up the site or turn off the heaters. And it's raining like crazy out there. I got a dig that's going to be full of water. If I don't get out there, as long as it takes, to get blood samples from all of you and run an antibodies count on them," Mary said. And Montoya must have gotten the message, because she straightened out her arm and held it still. Mary filled a vial with her blood, gave her her temp, and slid a tack bracelet on. Dunworthy watched her, wondering if she had been telling the truth. She hadn't said Montoya could leave after they had the test results, only that she had to stay here until they were in. And what then? Would they be taken to an isolation ward, together or separately, or given some sort of medication or more tests? Mary took Montoya's tack bracelet off and handed her the last set of papers. "Miss Aladama, you're next." Latimer stood up holding his papers. He looked at them confusedly, then set them down on the chair he'd been sitting on and started over to Mary, halfway there. He turned and went back for Mary's shopping bag. "You left this at Brasno's," he said, holding it out to Mary. "Oh, thank you." She said, "Just set it next to the table, won't you? These gloves are sterile." Latimer set the bag down, tipping it slightly. The end of the muffler trailed out on the floor. He methodically tucked it back in. "I'd completely forgotten I left it there," Mary said, watching him in all the excitement as she clapped her gloved hand over her mouth. "Oh my Lord, Colin. I'd forgotten all about him. What time is it?" "For 08, Montoya said, without looking at her digital. "He was supposed to come in at 3, Mary said, standing up and clattering the vials of blood in their carrier. "Perhaps when you weren't there, he went round to your rooms." Dunworthy said. She shook her head. "This is the first time he's been to Oxford. That's why I told him I'd be there to meet him. I never even gave him a thought until now," she said, almost to herself. "Well, then he'll still be at the underground station," Dunworthy said. "Shall I go and fetch him?" "No," she said. "You've been exposed. I'll phone the station. Then you can tell him to take a taxi here." "Where was he coming? In Cornmarket?" Yes, Cornmarket. Dunworthy rang up information. Got through on the third try, got the number off the screen and rang the station. The line was engaged. He hit disconnect and punched the number in again. Is Colin your grandson? Montoya said she had put aside her papers. The others didn't seem to be paying any attention to this latest development. Gilchrist was filling in his forms and glaring, as if this were one more example of negligence and incompetence. Latimer was sitting patiently by the tray. His sleeve rolled up. The medic was still asleep. Colin's my great-nephew, Mary said. He was coming up on the tube to spend Christmas with me. What time was the quarantine called? 3:10, Mary said. Dunworthy held up his hand to indicate he'd gotten through. Is that Cornmarket Underground Station? He said it obviously was. He could see the gates and a lot of people behind, an irritated-looking station master. I'm phoning about a boy who came in on the tube at 3 o'clock. He's 12. He would have come in from London. Dunworthy held his hand over the receiver and asked Mary, what does he look like? He's blonde and has blue eyes. He's tall for his age. Tall, Dunworthy said loudly over the sound of the crowd. His name is Colin Templar, Mary said. Deirdre said he'd taken the tube from Marble Arch at 1. Colin Templar, have you seen him? What the bloody hell do you mean? Have I seen him? The station master shouted. I've got 500 people in this station, and you want to know if I've seen a little boy? Look at this mess. The visual abruptly showed a milling crowd. Dunworthy scanned it, looking for a tallish boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. It switched back to the station master. There's just been a temp quarantine, he shouted, over the roar that seemed to get louder by the minute. And I've got a station full of people who want to know why the trains have stopped. And why don't I do something about it? I've got all I can do to keep them from tearing the place apart. I can't bother about a boy. His name is Colin Templar, Dunworthy shouted. His great-aunt was supposed to meet him. Well, why didn't she then? And make one less problem for me to deal with. I've got a crowd of angry people here who want to know how long the quarantine's going to last, and why don't I do something about that? He cut off suddenly. Dunworthy wondered if he'd hung up, or had the phone snatched out of his hand by an angry shopper. Had the station master seen him? Mary said no. Dunworthy said, you'll have to send someone after him. Yes, all right, I'll send one of the staff, she said, and started out. The quarantine was called at 3:10, and he wasn't supposed to get here till 3, Montoya said. Maybe he was late. That hadn't occurred to Dunworthy. If the quarantine had been called before his train reached Oxford, it would have been stopped at the nearest station, and the passengers rerouted or sent back to London. Bring the station back, he said. Handing her the phone, he told her the number. Tell them his train left Marble Arch at 1. I'll have Mary phone her niece. Perhaps Colin's back already. He went out in the corridor, intending to ask the nurse to fetch Mary, but she wasn't there. Mary must have sent her to the station. There was no one in the corridor. He looked down at the call box he had used before, and then walked rapidly down to it and punched in Baliol's number. There was an off chance that Colin had gone to Mary's rooms after all. He would send Finch round, and if Colin wasn't there, down to the station. It would very likely take more than one person looking to find Colin in that mess, a woman said. Dunworthy frowned at the number in the inset, but he hadn't misdialed. I'm trying to reach Mr. Finch at Berkeley College. He's not here right now, the woman, obviously American, said. I'm Miss Taylor, can I take a message? This must be one of the bell ringers. She was younger than he'd expected. Not much over 30, and she looked rather delicate to be a bell ringer. Would you have him call Mr. Dunworthy at the infirmary as soon as he returns, please? Mr. Dunworthy. She wrote it down and then looked up sharply. Mr. Dunworthy. She said in an entirely different tone of voice, "Are you the person responsible for our being held prisoner here?" There was no good answer to that. He should never have phoned the junior common room. He had sent Finch to the bursar's office. The National Health Service issues temp quarantines. In cases of an unidentified disease, it's a precautionary measure. I'm sorry for any inconvenience it's caused you. I've instructed my secretary to make your stay comfortable. And if there's anything I can do for you, do. You can get us to Ellie, that's what you can do. My ringers were supposed to give a handbell concert at the cathedral at 8 o'clock, and tomorrow we have to be in Norwich. We're ringing a peal on Christmas Eve. He was not about to be the one to tell her. They were not going to be in Norway tomorrow. Now, I'm sure that Ellie is already aware of the situation, but I will be more than happy to phone the cathedral and explain. Perhaps you'd like to explain it to me too. I'm not used to having my civil liberties taken away. Like this in America, nobody would dream of telling you where you can or can't go, and over 30 million Americans died during the pandemic. As a result of that sort of thinking, he thought, I assure you, madam, that the quarantine is solely for your protection, and that all of your concert dates will be more than willing to reschedule. In the meantime, Balio is delighted to have you as our guest. I am looking forward to meeting you in person. Your reputation precedes you, and if that were true, he thought, I would have told you Oxford was under quarantine when you wrote for permission to come. There is no way to reschedule a Christmas Eve peal. We were to have rung a new peal. The Chicago Surprise Minor, to know which chapter is counting on us to be there. And we intend. He hit the disconnect button. Finch was probably in the bursar's office, looking for Bardry's medical records. But Dunworthy wasn't going to risk getting another bell ringer. He looked up Regional Transport's number instead, and started to punch it in. The door at the end of the corridor opened, and Mary came through it. I'm trying Regional Transport. Dunworthy said, punching in the rest of the number, and passing her the receiver, she waved it away, smiling. It's all right, I've just spoken to Deirdre. Colin's train was stopped at Barton. The passengers were put on the tube back to London. She's going down to Marble Arch to meet him, she sighed. Deirdre didn't sound very glad that he's coming home. She planned to spend Christmas with her new live-ins family, and I think she rather wanted him out of the way. But it can't be helped, I'm simply glad he's out of this. He could hear the relief in her voice. He put the receiver back. Is it that bad? We just got the preliminary ident back. It's definitely a type of mixer virus, influenza. He had been expecting something worse, some third world fever or a retrovirus. He had had the flu back in the days before antivirals. He had felt terrible, congested, feverish and achy for a few days, and then gotten over it. Without anything but bed rest and fluids, will they call a quarantine off then? Not until we get Bardry's medical records, she said. I keep hoping. He skipped his last course of antivirals. If not, then we'll have to wait till we locate the source. But it's only the flu if there's a small antigenic shift. A point or two, it's only the flu. She corrected him. If there's a large shift, it's influenza, which is an entirely different matter. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 was a mix of viruses. It killed 20 million people. Viruses mutate every few months. Antigens on their surface change, so that they're unrecognizable to the immune system. That's why seasonals are necessary. But they can't protect against a large point shift, and that's what this is. I doubt it. Major mutations only happen every 10 years or so. I think it's more likely that Battery failed to get his seasonals. Do you know if he was running an on-site? At the beginning of term, no, he may have been. If he was, He may simply have forgotten to go in for them. In which case, all he has is this winter's flu. What about Kevin? Has she had her seasonals? Yes, and full-spectrum antivirals and T-cell enhancement. She's fully protected, even if it's influenza. She hesitated a fraction of a second if she was exposed to the virus. Through battery this morning, she is fully protected. And if she saw him before then, if I tell you this, you'll only worry, and I'm certain there's no need to. She took a breath. The enhancement and the antivirals were given so that she would have peak immunity at the beginning of the drop. And Gilchrist moved the drop up by 2 days. Dunworthy said bitterly, I wouldn't have allowed her to go through if I hadn't thought it was all right. But you hadn't counted on her being exposed to an influenza virus before she even left. No, but it doesn't change anything. She has partial immunity. And we're not certain she was even exposed. But we scarcely went near her. And what if she was exposed earlier? I knew I shouldn't have told you, Mary said. She sighed. Most myxoviruses have an incubation period of from 12 to 48 hours. Even if Kevin was exposed 2 days ago, she'd have had enough immunity to prevent the virus from replicating, sufficiently to cause anything but minor symptoms. But it's not influenza. She patted his arm. And you're forgetting the paradoxes. If she'd been exposed, she'd have been highly contagious. The net would never have let her through. She was right. Diseases couldn't go through the net. If there was any possibility of the contempts contracting, then the paradoxes wouldn't allow it. The net wouldn't have opened. What are the chances of the population in 1320 being immune, he asked. To a modern-day virus, almost none. There are 18 possible mutation points. The contempts would have all had to have had the exact virus. Or they'd be vulnerable. Vulnerable. I want to see Batry, he said. When he came to the pub, he said there was something wrong. He kept repeating it in the ambulance. On the way to the hospital, something is wrong, Mary said. He has a serious viral infection. Or he knows he exposed Kevin. Or he didn't get the fix. He said he got the fix. She looked sympathetically at him. I suppose it's useless to tell you not to worry about Kevin. You saw how I've just acted over Colin. But I meant it when I said they're both safer out of this. Kivrin's much better off where she is than she would be here. Even among those cutthroats and thieves you persist in imagining, at least, you won't have to deal with NHS quarantine regulations. He smiled. Or American change ringers. America hadn't been discovered yet. He reached for the door handle. The door at the end of the corridor banged open, and a large woman carrying a valise barged through it. There you are, Mr. Dunworthy, she shouted the length of the corridor. I've been looking everywhere for you. Is that one of your bell ringers? Mary said, turning to look down the corridor at her. Worse, Dunworthy said. It's Mrs. Gadsden. Chapter 6. It was growing dark under the trees, and at the bottom of the hill, Kevin's head began to ache before she had even reached the frozen wagon ruts, as if it had something to do with microscopic changes in altitude or light. She couldn't see the wagon at all, even standing directly in front of the little chest, and squinting into the darkness past the thicket made her head feel even worse. If this was one of the minor symptoms of time lag, she wondered what a major one would be like. When I get back, she thought, struggling through the thicket, I intend to have a little talk with Dr. Ahrens on the subject. I think they are underestimating the debilitating effects these minor symptoms can have. On an historian, walking down the hill, had left her more out of breath than climbing. It had, and she was so cold. Her cloak and then her hair caught on the willows as she pushed her way through the thicket, and she got a long scratch on her arm that immediately began to ache too. She tripped once and nearly fell flat, and the effect on her headache was to jolt it so that it stopped hurting and then returned with redoubled force. It was almost completely dark in the clearing, though what little she could see was still very clear. The colors not so much fading as deepening toward black. Black, green, and black, brown and black gray. The birds were settling in for the night. They must have got used to her. They didn't so much as pause in their pre-bedtime twitterings and settlements down. Kevin hastily grabbed up the scattered boxes and splintered kegs and flung them into the tilting wagon. She took hold of the wagon's tongue and began to pull it toward the road. The wagon scraped a few inches, slid easily across a patch of leaves and stuck. Givrin braced her foot and pulled again. It scraped a few more inches and tilted even more. One of the boxes fell out. Kevin put it back in and walked around the wagon, trying to see where it was stuck. The right wheel was jammed against a tree root, but it could be pushed up and over. If only she could get a decent purchase. She couldn't on this side. Medea had taken an axe to the side so that it would look like the wagon had been smashed when it overturned, and they had done a good job. It was nothing but splinters. I told Mr. Gilchrist. He should have let me have gloves, she thought. She came around to the other side, took hold of the wheel and shoved it, didn't budge. She pulled her skirts and cloak out of the way and knelt beside the wheel so she could put her shoulder to it. The footprint was in front of the wheel, in a little space, swept bare of leaves and only as wide as the foot. The leaves had drifted up against the roots of the oaks. On either side, the leaves did not hold any print that she could see in the graying light, but the print in the dirt was perfectly clear. It can't be a footprint, Kevin thought. The ground is frozen. She reached out to put her hand in the indentation, thinking it might be some trick of shadow or the failing light, the frozen ruts out in the road. Would not have taken any print at all, but the dirt gave easily under her hand, and the print was deep enough to feel. It had been made by a soft-soled shoe with no heel, and the foot that had made it was large, larger even than hers. A man's foot, but men in the 1300s had been smaller, shorter with feet not even as big as hers, and this was a giant's foot. Maybe it's an old footprint, she thought wildly. Maybe it's the footprint of a woodcutter or a peasant looking for a lost sheep. Maybe this is one of the king's woodlands, and they've been through here hunting. But it wasn't the footprint of someone chasing a deer. It was the print of someone who had stood there for a long time watching her. I heard him, she thought, and a little flutter of panic forced itself up into her throat. I heard him standing there. She was still kneeling, holding on to the wheel for balance. If the man, whoever it was, and it had to be a man, a giant, was still here in this glade watching, he must know that she had found the footprint. She stood up. Hello, she called, and frightened the birds to death again. They flapped and squawked themselves into hushed silence. Is someone there? She waited, listening, and it seemed to her that in the silence she could hear the breathing again. Spake, she said, "Ye arm in distress on me, Savitas fled." Lovely, she thought, even as she said it. Tell him you're helpless and all alone. Hello. She called again and began a cautious circuit of the glade, peering out into the trees if he was still standing there. It was so dark she wouldn't be able to see him. She couldn't make out anything past the edges of the glade. She couldn't even tell for sure which way the thicket and the road lay. If she waited any longer, it would be completely dark, and she would never be able to get the wagon to the road, but she couldn't move the wagon. Whoever had stood there between the two trees, watching her, knew that the wagon was here. Maybe he had even seen it come through, bursting on the sparkling air, like something conjured by an alchemist. If that were the case, he'd probably run off to get the stake. Downworthy was so sure the populace kept in readiness. But surely, if that were the case, he would have said something. even if it was only yikes or Heavenly Father, and she would have heard him. Crashing through the underbrush as he ran away. He hadn't run away though, which meant he hadn't seen her come through. He had come upon her afterward, lying inexplicably in the middle of the woods, beside a smashed wagon, and thought what? That she had been attacked on the road, and then dragged here to hide the evidence. Then why hadn't he tried to help her? Why had he stood there silent as an oak, long enough to leave a deep footprint, and then gone away again? Maybe he had thought she was dead. He would have been frightened of her unshriven body, people as late as the 5th-10th century had believed that evil spirits took immediate possession of any body not properly buried, or maybe he had gone for help to one of those villages that Kevin had heard, maybe even Skengate, and was even now on his way back with half the town, all of them carrying lanterns. In that case, she should stay where she was and wait for him to come back. She should even lie down again when the townspeople arrived. They could speculate about her and then bear her to the village, giving her examples of the language, the way. Her plan had been intended to work in the first place, but what if he came back alone, or with friends who had no intention of helping her? She couldn't think. Her headache had spread out from her temple to behind her eyes as she rubbed her forehead. It began to throb, and she was so cold. This cloak, in spite of its rabbit fur lining, wasn't warm at all. How had people survived the Little Ice Age, dressed only in cloaks like this? How had the rabbits survived? At least she could do something about the code. She could gather some wood and start a fire, and then, if the footprint person came back with evil intentions, she could hold him off with a flaming brand. And if he had gone for help and not been able to find his way back in the dark, the fire would lead him to her. She made the circuit of the grave again, looking for wood. Dunworthy had insisted. She learned to build a fire without tinder or flint. Girl Chase expects you to wander around the Middle Ages in the dead of winter without knowing how to build a fire, he had said, outraged. As she had defended him, told him, medieval, didn't expect her to spend that much time out of doors, but they should have realized how cold it could get. The sticks made her hands cold, and every time she bent over to pick up a stick, her head hurt. Eventually she stopped bending over altogether and simply stooped and grabbed for the broken off twigs, keeping her head straight. That helped a little, but not much. Maybe she was feeling this way because she was so cold. Maybe the headache, the breathlessness were coming from being so cold. She had to get the fire started, though it felt icy cold and wet. It would never burn, and the leaves would be damp. Too far to damp to use for tinder. She had to have dry kindling and a sharp stick to start a fire. She laid the wood down in a little bundle by the roots of a tree, careful to keep her head straight, and went back to the wagon. The bashed inside of the wagon had several broken pieces of wood she could use for kindling. She got to splinters in her hand before she managed to pull the pieces free, but the wood at least felt dry. Though it was cold too, there was a large, sharp spur of wood just above the wheel. She bent over to grab it and nearly fell, gasping with a sudden nauseating dizziness. "You'd better lie down," she said out loud. She eased herself to sitting, holding on to the ribs of the wagon for support. "Dr. Ahrens," she said a little breathlessly, "you ought to come up with something to prevent time lag. This is awful. If she could just lie down for a bit, perhaps the dizziness would go away. And she could build the fire. She couldn't do it without bending over though. And just the thought of doing that brought the nausea back. She pulled her hood up over her head and closed her eyes, and even that hurt. The action seeming to focus the pain in her head. Something was wrong. This could not possibly be a reaction to time lag. She was supposed to have a few minor symptoms that would fade within an hour or two of her arrival, not get worse. A little headache, Dr. Ahrens had said. Some fatigue. She hadn't said anything about nausea. About being racked with cold. She was so cold. She pulled the skirts of her cloak around her, like a blanket, but the action seemed to make her even colder. Her teeth began to chatter, the way they had up on the hill, and great convulsive shudders shook her shoulders. I'm going to freeze to death, she thought, but it can't be helped. I can't get up and start the fire. I can't undo cold. It's too bad you were wrong about the contempts. Mr. Dunworthy, she thought, and even the thought was dizzy. Being burned at the stake sounds lovely. She would not have believed that. She could have fallen asleep. Huddled there on the cold ground, she had not noticed any spreading warmth. And if she had, she would have been afraid. It was the creeping numbness of hypothermia. And tried to fight it, but she must have slept. Because when she opened her eyes again, it was night in the glade, full night, with frosty stars in the net of branches overhead. And she was on the ground looking up at them. She had slid down as she slept, so that the top of her head was against the wheel. She was still shivering with cold. Though her teeth had stopped chattering, her head had begun to throb, tolling like a bell, and her whole body ached, especially her chest, where she had held the wood against her, while she gathered sticks for the fire. Something's wrong, she thought, and this time there was real panic in the thought. Maybe she was having some kind of allergic reaction to time travel. Was there even such a thing? Dunworthy had never said anything about an allergic reaction, and he had warned her about everything: rape and cholera and typhoid and the plague. She twisted her hand around inside the cloak and felt under her arm for the place where she had had the welt from the anti-viral inoculation. The welt was still there, though it didn't hurt to touch it, and it had stopped itching. Maybe that was a bad sign, she thought. Maybe the fact that it had stopped itching meant that it had stopped working. She tried to lift her head. The dizziness came back instantly. She lay her head back down and disentangled her hands from the cloak. Carefully and slowly, the nausea cutting across every movement. She folded her hands and pressed them against her face. Mr. Dunworthy, she said, I think you better come and get me. She slept again, and when she woke up, she could hear the faint, jangling sound of the piped-in Christmas music. Oh good, she thought, they've got the net open, and tried to pull herself to sitting against the wheel. Oh Mr. Dunworthy, I'm so glad you came back, she said, fighting the nausea. I was afraid you wouldn't get my message. The jangling sound became louder, and she could see a wavering light. She pulled herself up a little farther. You got the fire started, she said. You were right about it getting cold. The wagon's wheel felt icy through her cloak. Her teeth started to chatter again. Dr. Ahrens was right. I should have waited till the swelling went down. I didn't know the reaction would be this bad. It wasn't a fire after all, it was a lantern. Dunworthy was carrying it as he walked towards her. This doesn't mean I'm getting a virus, does it, or the plague? She was having trouble getting the words out. Her teeth were chattering so hard. Wouldn't that be awful? Having the plague in the Middle Ages, at least I'd fit right in. She laughed a high-pitched, almost hysterical laugh. That would probably frighten Mr. Dunworthy to death. It's all right, she said, and she could hardly understand her own words. I know you were worried, but I'll be perfectly all right. He stopped in front of her, the lantern lighting a wobbling circle on the ground in front of her. She could see Dunworthy's feet. He was wearing shapeless leather shoes, the kind that had made the footprint. She tried to say something about the shoes, to ask him whether Mr. Gilchrist had made him put on authentic, medieval dress just to come and fetch her. But the light's movement was making her dizzy again. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, he was kneeling in front of her. He had set the lantern down, and the light lit the hood of his cloak. And folded hands. "It's all right," she said. "I know you were worried, but I'm all right. Truly, I just felt a little ill." He raised his head. Certus it had been Delis to Deus, forgot for Augustus his antis amala. He said he had a hard-line face, a cruel face, a cutthroat's face. He had watched her lying there, and then he had gone away and waited for it to get dark. And now he had come back. Kevin tried to put up a hand to fend him off, but her hands had got tangled somehow in the cloak. "Go away," she said, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't get the words out. "Go away." He said something else with a rising inflection, this time a question. She couldn't understand what he was saying. It's Middle English, she thought. I studied it for 3 years, and Mr. Latimer taught me everything there is to know about adjectival inflection. I should be able to understand it. It's the fever, she thought. That's why I can't make out what he's saying. He repeated the question or asked some other question. She couldn't even tell that much. "It's because I'm ill," she thought. "I can't understand him because I'm ill." "Kind sir," she began, but she could not remember the rest of the speech. "Help me," she said, and tried to think how to say that in Middle English, but she couldn't remember anything. But the church Latin, "Domino et adjuvanda me faustina," she said. He bowed his head over his hands and began to murmur, so low she could not hear, and then she must have lost consciousness again, because he had picked her up and was carrying her. She could still hear the jangling sound of the bells from the open net, and she tried to tell what direction they were coming from, but her teeth were chattering so hard she couldn't hear. "I'm ill," she said. As he set her on the white horse, she fell forward. Clutching at the horse's mane to keep from falling off. He put his hand up to her side and held her there. "I don't know how this happened. I had all my inoculations." He led the donkey off slowly. The bells on its bridle jingled tinny. Transcript from the Doomsday Book. "Mr. Dunworthy, I think you better come and get me." Chapter 7. "I knew it," Mrs. Gadsden said, steaming down the corridor toward them. "He's contracted some horrible disease, hasn't he? It's all that rowing." Mary stepped forward. "You can't come in here," she said. "This is an isolation area." Mrs. Gadsden kept coming. The transparent poncho she was wearing over her coat threw off large, spattering drops as she walked toward them, swinging the veils like a weapon. "You can't put me off like that. I'm his mother. I demand to see him." Mary put up her hand like a policeman. "Stop," she said in her best ward sister voice. Amazingly, Mrs. Gadsden stopped. "A mother has a right to see her son," she said. Her expression softened. "Is he very ill?" "If you mean your son William, he's not ill at all," Mary said. "At least so far as I know." She put her hand up again. "Please don't come any closer. Why do you think William's ill?" "I knew at the moment I heard about the quarantine. A sharp pain went through me. When the station master said temp quarantine, she sat down the valise so she could indicate the location of the sharp pain. It's because he didn't take his vitamins. I asked the college to be sure to give them to him," she said, shooting a glance at Dunworthy. "That was the rival of any of Gilchrist, and they said he was able to take care of himself. Well, obviously they were wrong. William is not the reason. The temp quarantine was called. One of the university techs has come down with a viral infection," Mary said. Dunworthy noticed gratefully that she didn't say Balliol's tech. The tech is the only case, and there is no indication that there will be any others, Mary said. the quarantine is a purely precautionary measure. I assure you, Mrs. Gardens didn't look convinced. My Willie's always been sickly, and he simply will not take care of himself. He studies far too hard in that drafty room of his. She said with another dark look at Dunworthy, I'm surprised he hasn't come down with a viral infection. Before this, Mary took her hand down and put it in the pocket she carried her bleeper in. I do hope she's calling for help, Dunworthy thought. By the end of one term at Berlioz, William's health was completely broken down, and then his tutor forced him to stay up over Christmas. And read Petrarch, Mrs. Gadsden said that's why I came up. The thought of him all alone, in this horrid place for Christmas, eating heaven knows what, and doing all sorts of things to endanger his health, was something this mother's heart could simply not bear. She pointed to the place where the pain had gone through her, at the words Temquintine, and it is positively providential that I came when I did. Positively providential I nearly missed the train. My valise was so cumbersome and I almost thought, well, there'll be another along, but I wanted to get to my Willie. So I shouted at them to hold the doors, and I handsomely stepped off. At Cornmarket, when the station master said, "Temp quarantine train service is temporarily suspended," only just think. If I'd missed that train and taken the next one, I would have been stopped by the quarantine. Only just think. I'm sure William will be surprised to see you. Dunworthy said, hoping she would go find him. Yes, she said grimly. He's probably sitting there without even his muffler on. He'll get this viral infection. I know it, he gets everything. He used to break out in horrible rashes when he was little. He's bound to come down with it at least. His mother is here to nurse him through it. The door was flung open, and to people wearing masks, gowns, gloves, and some sort of paper covering over their shoes, came racing through it. They slowed to a walk when they saw there was no one, collapsed on the floor. I need this area cordoned off and an isolation ward sign posted. Mary said. She turned to Mrs. Gadsden. I'm afraid there's a possibility you've been exposed to the virus. We do not have a positive mode of transmission yet, and we can't rule out the possibility of its being airborne, she said, and for one horrible moment, Dunworthy thought she meant to put Mrs. Gadsden in the waiting room with them. Would you escort Mrs. Gadsden to an isolation cubicle? She asked one of the masked and gowned. We'll need to run blood tests and get a list of your contacts. Mr. Dunworthy, if you'll just come with me, she said, and led him into the waiting room and shut the door. Before Mrs. Gadsden could protest, they can keep her a while and give poor Billy a few last hours of freedom. That woman would make anyone break out in a rash. He said. Everyone except the medic had looked up at their entrance. Latimer was sitting patiently by the tray. His sleeve rolled up. Montoya was still using the phone. Colin's train was turned back. Mary said he's safely at home by now. Oh, good. Montoya said and put the phone down. Gilchrist leapt for it. Mr. Latimer, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Mary said. She broke open a pair of impermeable gloves, put them on, and began assembling a punch. Gilchrist here. I wish to speak with a senior tutor. Gilchrist said into the telephone. Yes, I am trying to reach Mr. Basingham. Yes, I'll wait. The senior tutor has no idea where he is. Dunworthy thought, and neither has the secretary. He had already spoken to them when he was trying to stop the drop. The secretary hadn't even known he was in Scotland. I'm glad they found the kid. Montoya said, looking at her digital. How long do you think they'll keep us here? I've got to get back to my dig before it turns into a swamp. We're excavating Skengate's churchyard right now. Most of the graves date from the 1400s, but we've got some Black Deaths and a few pre-William. The Conquerors. Last week we found a knight's tomb. Beautiful condition. I wonder if Kevin's there yet. Dunworthy assumed she meant at the village. And not in one of the graves. I hope so, he said. I told her to start recording her observations of Skengate immediately, the village and the church, especially the tomb, the inscriptions partly worn off, and some of the carving, the dates readable, though 1318. It's an emergency, Gilchrist said. He fumed through a long pause. I know he's fishing in Scotland, I want to know where. Mary put a plaster on Latimer's arm and motioned to Gilchrist. He shook his head at her. She went over to the medic and shook her awake. She followed her over to the tray, blinking sleepily. There are so many things. Only direct observation can tell us, Montoya said. I told Kevin to record every detail. I hope there's room on the recorder. It's so small. She looked at her watch again. Of course it had to be. Did you get a chance to see it before they implanted it? It really does look like a bone spur. Bone spur, Dunworthy said, watching the medic's blood spurt into the vial. That's so it can't cause an anachronism. Even if it's discovered, it fits right against the palmar surface of the scaphoid bone. She rubbed the wrist bone above the thumb. Mary motioned to Dunworthy, and the medic stood up, rolling down her sleeve. Dunworthy took a place in the chair. Mary peeled the back from a monitor, stuck it to the inside of Dunworthy's wrist, and handed him a tent to swallow. Have the bursar call me at this number as soon as he returns, Gilchrist said, and hung up. Montoya snatched up the phone, punched in a number and said, "Hi, can you tell me the quarantine perimeter? I need to know if Whitney's inside it. My dig's there." Whoever she was talking to apparently told her no. Then who can I talk to? About getting the perimeter changed. It's an emergency. They're worried about their emergencies. Dunworthy thought, and neither of them's even given a thought to worrying about Kevin. Well, what was there to worry about? Her quarter had been disguised to look like a bone spur, so it wouldn't cause an anachronism when the contempts decided to chop off her hands before they burned her at the stake. Mary took his blood pressure and then jabbed him with the punch. "If the phone ever becomes available," she said, snapping on the plaster and motioning to Gilchrist, who was standing next to Montoya looking impatient, "you might ring up William Gadsden and warn him that his mother's coming." Montoya said, "Yes, the number for the National Trust," hung up the phone, and scribbled a number on one of the brochures. The phone trailed Gilchrist halfway to Mary, launched himself at it, grabbing it up before Montoya could reach it. "No," he said, and handed it grudgingly over to Dunworthy. It was Finch. He was in the bursar's office. "Have you got Patrice's medical records?" Dunworthy said, "Yes, sir. The police are here, sir. They're looking for places to put all the detainees who don't live in Oxford, and they want us to put them up at Balliol," Dunworthy said. "Yes, sir. How many shall I tell them we can take?" Mary had stood up, Gilchrist's vial of blood in hand, and was signaling to Dunworthy. "Wait a minute, please," he said, and punched. "Hold on the mouthpiece." "Are they asking you to board detainees?" Mary asked. "Yes." He said, "Don't commit to filling all your rooms." She said, "We may need infirmary space." Dunworthy took his hand away and said, "Tell them we can put them in Fisher, and whatever rooms are left in Salvin. If you haven't assigned rooms to the bell ringers, double M up, tell the police. Infirmary has asked for Buckley Johnson as an emergency ward." "Did you say you'd found Bardry's medical records?" "Yes, sir. I had the very devil of a time finding them. The bursar had filed them under Bardry, Chowd Harry and the Americans. Did you find his NHS number?" "Yes, sir. I'm putting Dr. Aarons on," he said before Finch could launch into tales of the bell ringers. He motioned to Mary. "You can give her the information directly." Mary attached a plaster to Gilchrist's arm and a tempometer to the back of his hand. "I got through to Eliza," Finch said. "I informed them of the handbell concert cancellation, and they were quite pleasant, but the Americans are still very unhappy." Mary finished entering Latimer's reads, stripped off the gloves, and came over to take the phone from Dunworthy. "Finch, Dr. Arenz here. Read me Baudry's and HS number." Dunworthy handed her his secondary sheet and a pencil, and she wrote it down, and then asked for Baudry's inoculation records, and made a number of notations. Dunworthy couldn't decipher any reactions or allergies. There was a pause, and then she said, "All right, no. I can get the rest off the computer. I'll ring you back if I need additional information." She handed the phone back to Dunworthy. "He wants to speak with you again," she said, and left, taking the paper with her. "They're most unhappy at being kept here," Finch said. "Miss Taylor is threatening to sue for involuntary breach of contract." When was Baudry's last course of antivirus? Finch took a considerable time, looking through his sheaf of papers. "Here it is, sir, September 14th. Did he have the full course?" "Yes, sir. Receptor analogs, MPA booster, and seasonals." "Has he ever had a reaction to an antiviral?" "No, sir. There's nothing under allergies in the history. I already told Dr. Arenz that." But Baudry had had all his antivirals. He had no history of reactions. "Have you been to New College yet?" Dunworthy asked. "No, sir. I'm just on my way. What should I do about supplies, sir?" "We've adequate stocks of soap, but we're very low on lavatory paper." The door opened, but it wasn't Mary. It was the medic who had been sent to fetch Montoya. He went over to the tea trolley and plugged in the electric kettle. "Should I ration the lavatory paper, do you think, sir?" Finch said, "or put up notices, asking everyone to conserve whatever you think best." Dunworthy said and rang off. It must still be raining. The medic's uniform was wet, and when the kettle boiled, he put his red hands over the steam, as if trying to warm them. "Are you quite finished using the telephone?" Gilchrist said. Dunworthy handed it to him. He wondered what the weather was like where Kevin was, and whether Gilchrist had had probability. "Compute the chances of her coming through in the rain."